the vast expanse of territory stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to the shores of the Black Sea witnessed the emergence of one of history's most consequential Germanic peoples during the tumultuous 3rd century AD. In the dense forests of modern-day Ukraine and the rolling steppes that bordered the ancient world's northeastern frontier, the Thervingi tribe began to coalesce into a distinct political and cultural entity that would eventually evolve into the Visigoths. These early Gothic peoples inhabited a landscape of remarkable diversity, where primeval oak and beech forests gave way to fertile river valleys and expansive grasslands that stretched toward the distant Pontic shores. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Dniester River reveals that the Thervingi established their settlements in strategic locations that maximised both defensive capabilities and agricultural potential. Their villages typically occupied elevated positions overlooking river bends, providing natural protection while ensuring access to water sources essential for both human consumption and livestock. The physical remains of these early settlements show rectangular timber-framed houses with stone foundations, often measuring between 15 and 20 metres in length. These structures featured central hearths constructed from carefully arranged fieldstones, with smoke holes cut through thatched roofs supported by sturdy wooden beams harvested from the surrounding forests. The Thervingi developed sophisticated agricultural practices adapted to the specific environmental conditions of their homeland. They cultivated barley, wheat, and rye in the fertile alluvial soils of river valleys, while maintaining extensive herds of cattle, sheep, and horses on the grasslands that extended beyond the forest margins. Their farming techniques incorporated crop rotation systems that allowed fields to remain productive over multiple growing seasons, demonstrating an understanding of soil management that surpassed many contemporary Germanic peoples. Archaeological analysis of storage pits found at Thervingi sites reveals evidence of surplus grain production, indicating that these communities had moved beyond subsistence-level agriculture to develop food security systems capable of supporting larger populations. The tribal structure of early Thervingi society reflected a complex hierarchy that balanced traditional Germanic democratic elements with emerging aristocratic leadership. At the apex of this social pyramid stood the rakes, a hereditary nobility whose authority derived from both martial prowess and control over landed resources. These aristocratic families maintained their positions through the distribution of wealth gained from successful military campaigns, the patronage of skilled craftsmen, and the careful management of agricultural surpluses. Below the rakes, a class of free warriors formed the backbone of Thervingi military organisation, with each man obligated to provide his own weapons and equipment when called to serve in tribal conflicts or raiding expeditions. The material culture of the Thervingi bore the distinctive hallmarks of what archaeologists term the Chernyakov culture, a sophisticated cultural complex that flourished across much of present-day Ukraine between approximately 200 and 450 AD. This archaeological horizon provides crucial insights into the daily lives, technological capabilities, and artistic sensibilities of the early Visigoths. Chernyakov pottery, characterized by its fine-tempered clay and elegant proportions, demonstrates advanced ceramic techniques that produce vessels suitable for both utilitarian and ceremonial purposes. The potters of this culture created distinctive wheel-thrown vessels with polished surfaces, often decorated with incised geometric patterns that reflected broader artistic traditions shared among Gothic peoples. Metalworking represented another area of exceptional Thervingi craftsmanship, with archaeological sites yielding evidence of sophisticated techniques for producing both weapons and decorative objects. Their smiths mastered the art of pattern welding, a complex process that created sword blades of exceptional strength and distinctive serpentine patterns visible along the metal surface. These weapons, often measuring over 80 centimetres in length, featured carefully balanced proportions that made them effective both for thrusting attacks and sweeping cuts. The hilts of Thervingi swords typically incorporated organic materials such as bone or antler, wrapped with leather or textile bindings to ensure secure grip during combat. The warrior culture that permeated Thervingi society found expression not only in their weapons and military organisation, but also in their burial practices and religious observances. Archaeological excavations of Thervingi cemeteries reveal graves containing complete weapon sets, including swords, spears, shields, and sometimes horse equipment, indicating the central role that martial identity played in their conception of personal honour and social status. These burials often included elaborate belt fittings decorated with intricate metalwork, suggesting that even everyday objects served as markers of warrior identity and tribal affiliation. Trade relationships with Roman territories developed gradually throughout the 3rd century, initially focusing on the exchange of amber, furs and slaves for Roman manufactured goods, wine and precious metals. Thervingi merchants travelled established routes that connected their homeland with Roman frontier posts along the Danube, carrying amber harvested from Baltic shores and high-quality furs obtained through networks extending deep into the northern forests. Roman archaeological sites near the Danubian frontier have yielded Gothic-produced goods, including distinctively decorated pottery and metalwork that demonstrate the extent of these early commercial relationships. The nature of Thervingi contact with Rome evolved considerably as the 3rd century progressed, shifting from purely commercial interactions to include both hostile raids and formal diplomatic negotiations. Gothic warbands began launching attacks across the Danube during the 240 SAD, targeting Roman settlements in Dacia and Moesia, with increasing frequency and coordination. These raids typically involved forces numbering in the hundreds rather than thousands, suggesting that they represented the actions of individual war leaders rather than coordinated tribal policy. The raiders sought portable wealth, including coins, precious metals, and captives who could be sold in slave markets or ransomed back to Roman authorities. Roman responses to these incursions varied considerably depending on the military situation along other frontier sectors and the political stability within the empire itself. Emperor Philip the Arab attempted to address Gothic pressure through diplomatic means during the late 240 S, offering annual payments in exchange for peace along the Danubian frontier. These subsidies, while temporarily effective in reducing the frequency of raids, also served to demonstrate Roman weakness and encouraged further Gothic demands for tribute and territorial concessions. The Thervingi political organisation during this period remained fundamentally decentralised, with individual war leaders maintaining considerable autonomy in their decisions regarding both military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations with Rome. This fragmented authority structure meant that agreements reached with one Gothic leader did not necessarily bind other tribal factions, creating ongoing instability along the frontier that Roman administrators found increasingly difficult to manage effectively. Archaeological evidence from Thervingi settlements dating to the mid-3 RD century reveals increasing quantities of Roman goods, including coins, pottery and metal objects that indicate growing economic integration despite periodic military conflicts. These materials appear in contexts suggesting they arrived through both legitimate trade and military plunder, with some Roman coins showing evidence of having been deliberately damaged or modified for use as decorative elements in Gothic jewellery and belt fittings. The religious practices of the early Thervingi combined traditional Germanic elements with influences absorbed through contact with various peoples encountered during their migrations from Scandinavia. They maintained sacred groves within their territories where tribal assemblies gathered to make important decisions regarding war, peace, and internal disputes. These woodland sanctuaries typically centred around particularly ancient or impressive trees, often oaks that had achieved remarkable size and were believed to embody the presence of divine forces. Archaeological investigation of sites associated with Thervingi religious activity has uncovered evidence of ritual deposits, including weapons, jewellery, and animal remains that suggest complex ceremonial practices designed to ensure divine favour for military campaigns and agricultural endeavours. The social organisation of Tervingi communities reflected their adaptation to the specific environmental and political challenges of their Black Sea homeland. Extended family groups, known as Sippen, form the basic units of social organisation, with several related families typically occupying adjacent farmsteads within larger village complexes. These kinship networks provided the foundation for military recruitment, with warbands often composed primarily of men drawn from related family groups who had trained together since childhood and could rely on established bonds of trust and mutual obligation during combat situations. The delicate balance of power that had characterised the relationship between the Tervingi and their neighbouring peoples across the Pontic steppes began to deteriorate dramatically during the final decades of the 4th century. From the distant reaches of Central Asia, a confederation of nomadic warriors under the leadership of Attila and his predecessors had been steadily expanding westward, displacing established populations and disrupting the complex network of tribal territories that stretch from the Volga River to the Carpathian Mountains. The Huns, as Roman sources would later identify these fierce horsemen, possessed military capabilities and organisational structures that proved devastatingly effective against the more sedentary agricultural peoples they encountered during their relentless advance toward Europe. Archaeological evidence from sites across modern Ukraine reveals the sudden abandonment of numerous Tervingi settlements during the 370s, with many locations showing clear signs of hasty evacuation rather than gradual demographic decline. Excavations at these abandoned villages have uncovered caches of buried valuables, including silver arm rings, decorative brooches, and coin hoards that their owners apparently intended to retrieve once conditions stabilised. The fact that these treasures remained buried for centuries indicates that their depositors never returned, suggesting the catastrophic nature of the population displacement that occurred during this period. The Hunnic military system represented a fundamental departure from the warfare practices familiar to Gothic peoples. While the Tervingi and their neighbours relied primarily on infantry formations supported by limited cavalry forces, the Huns operated as highly mobile mounted archers, capable of striking targets across vast distances before disappearing back into the steppes. Their composite bows, constructed from layers of wood, horn and sinew, could launch arrows with sufficient force to penetrate mail armour at ranges exceeding 300 metres. This technological advantage, combined with their superior horsemanship and tactical flexibility, allowed relatively small Hunnic forces to defeat much larger Gothic armies that lacked adequate cavalry support. The collapse of the Greuthungi kingdom, around 375 AD, marked the beginning of a cascading series of population movements that would fundamentally reshape the demographic landscape of southeastern Europe. The Greuthungi, who occupied territories east of the Dniester River and maintained more direct contact with the advancing Hunnic forces, found themselves unable to mount effective resistance against enemies who refused to engage in the type of set-piece battles that characterised traditional Germanic warfare. Their king Alaric, described in Gothic oral traditions as a ruler of exceptional longevity and military prowess, reportedly chose suicide rather than submit to Hunnic domination, though the historical accuracy of this account remains disputed among modern scholars. The destruction of Greuthungi political authority created immediate pressure on the Tervingi territories located further west, as refugees from the collapsed kingdom began arriving in increasing numbers throughout 375 and early 376. These displaced populations brought with them first-hand accounts of Hunnic military capabilities and the futility of attempting to resist their advance through conventional means. Fritigern, who had emerged as the dominant leader among the Tervingi following earlier conflicts with rival claimants to tribal authority, faced the impossible choice between attempting to defend territories that had been Gothic homeland for generations or abandoning them in favour of seeking refuge within Roman boundaries. the decision to approach Roman authorities for permission to cross the Danube represented a dramatic departure from traditional Gothic policy, which had generally viewed the empire as either a source of plunder or a diplomatic partner to be negotiated with from a position of strength. Contemporary Roman sources, particularly the detailed account provided by the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, describe the Gothic embassy that arrived at the court of Emperor Valens during the winter of 376. The Gothic representatives, speaking through interpreters familiar with both Latin and Gothic languages, presented their situation in terms designed to appeal to Roman strategic interests, while emphasizing the desperate nature of their circumstances. Fritigern's negotiations with Roman officials required careful attention to the complex political dynamics that characterized imperial decision-making during this period. Emperor Valens, who maintained his primary residence in Constantinople and focused much of his attention on eastern frontier problems involving Sassanid Persia, initially viewed the Gothic request as an opportunity to strengthen Roman military resources through the recruitment of experienced warriors. The empire had long relied on barbarian federates to supplement regular army units, and the prospect of incorporating large numbers of Gothic fighters into the system appeared to offer significant advantages for future military campaigns. The terms negotiated for Gothic settlement within Roman territory reflected the standard federati arrangements that had governed similar agreements with other barbarian peoples during previous decades. The Thervingi would receive designated lands within the province of Thrace, where they could establish agricultural communities while maintaining their traditional social organisation and religious practices. In exchange, Gothic warriors would serve in Roman military campaigns when called upon, providing cavalry and infantry forces under the command of their own leaders, but operating within the broader strategic framework established by imperial commanders. The actual crossing of the Danube during the spring of 376 involved logistical challenges that strained the administrative capabilities of local Roman officials. Contemporary sources suggest that the Gothic migration included between 60,000 and 100,000 individuals, representing not only warriors and their immediate families, but also the broader tribal community including craftsmen, farmers, slaves, and livestock herds. The river crossing required the coordination of numerous ferry operations, using both Roman military vessels and hastily constructed rafts, with the entire process extending over several weeks as different tribal groups waited their turn to reach the southern bank. Roman military commanders responsible for overseeing the Gothic settlement quickly discovered that managing such large numbers of armed barbarians presented difficulties that had not been adequately anticipated during the initial negotiations. The designated settlement areas in Thrace lacked sufficient infrastructure to support the incoming population, while local Roman communities viewed the Gothic presence with suspicion and hostility. Competition for agricultural land, grazing rights, and access to markets created tensions that Roman administrators found increasingly difficult to mediate effectively. The deteriorating relationship between Gothic settlers and Roman authorities reached a critical point during the winter of 377, when food shortages and administrative corruption combined to create conditions of genuine hardship among the recently arrived Thervingi communities. Roman officials, including the Comes Lupicanes and the Dux Maximus, reportedly engaged in profiteering schemes that involved selling food supplies to desperate Goths at inflated prices, while simultaneously demanding additional tribute payments beyond those specified in the original settlement agreements. These practices violated both the letter and spirit of the Foederati Compact, providing Fritigern with legitimate grounds for complaint against imperial administration. The outbreak of open hostilities between Gothic settlers and Roman forces during 377 represented the culmination of mounting tensions that had been building since the initial river crossing. The immediate trigger appears to have been an incident at Adrianople. where Roman officials attempted to detain Gothic leaders during what was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting to address ongoing supply problems. When fighting broke out within the city, Gothic warriors who had been waiting outside the walls launched an assault that quickly overwhelmed the local garrison and resulted in the massacre of numerous Roman civilians. The Gothic military response to Roman treachery demonstrated the continued effectiveness of traditional Germanic warfare tactics when employed by experienced commanders operating on familiar terrain. Fritigern organised his forces into mobile columns that avoided direct confrontation with larger Roman army units, while systematically attacking isolated garrisons, supply convoys, and undefended settlements throughout Thrace. This strategy maximised Gothic advantages in mobility and local knowledge, while minimising their vulnerability to the superior siege equipment and disciplined formations that characterised regular Roman military units. Emperor Valens, who had been campaigning against Sassanid forces in the eastern provinces when news of the Gothic uprising reached Constantinople, immediately began preparations for a major military expedition designed to crush the rebellion and restore imperial authority in the affected territories. The emperor's decision to personally lead this campaign reflected both the serious nature of the Gothic threat and his desire to achieve a decisive victory that would enhance his military reputation and political standing within the empire. The Roman army that assembled for the campaign against Fritigern represented one of the largest military forces that the Eastern Empire had deployed during the 4th century. Contemporary sources describe a combined force of approximately 40,000 men, including regular legionary units drawn from frontier garrisons across the eastern provinces, auxiliary cavalry squadrons recruited from various barbarian peoples, and specialised siege equipment transported from imperial armories. The army's composition reflected the increasingly diverse character of late Roman military organisation, with units of Gallic and Germanic federates serving alongside traditional Mediterranean recruits. The strategic situation that confronted Valens as his army advanced into Thrace during the summer of 378 had evolved considerably since the initial Gothic uprising began the previous year. Fritigern had succeeded in establishing effective control over much of the countryside between the Danube and the approaches to Constantinople, while Roman forces remained confined to fortified positions that could be supplied only through heavily guarded convoys. The Gothic leader had also managed to negotiate alliances with other barbarian groups, including bands of Alani and Hunnic warriors who provided additional cavalry support for his operations against Roman targets. The convergence of Roman and Gothic forces near the city of Adrianople on August 9th, 378, occurred under circumstances that favoured neither side decisively. Valens had been attempting to locate and engage the main Gothic army for several weeks, while Fritigern had been seeking to avoid a major battle until he could concentrate all available forces and choose favourable terrain for the encounter. The actual engagement developed when Roman scouting units made contact with Gothic outposts during the early morning hours, leading to a series of escalating skirmishes that drew both armies into a general battle neither commander had originally intended to fight that day. The Battle of Adrianople unfolded across terrain that provided significant advantages to the Gothic forces, who had positioned themselves on elevated ground overlooking the approaches from the direction of the Roman advance. Fritigern had arranged his army in a defensive formation centred around a circular wagon fort, with infantry units deployed behind improvised fortifications constructed from overturned carts and agricultural equipment. This tactical arrangement allowed Gothic warriors to maintain secure positions while forcing Roman attackers to advance uphill across open ground, exposed to archer fire and cavalry charges from the flanks. The Roman assault began with coordinated attacks by legionary units supported by auxiliary archers and slingers, but these initial efforts failed to achieve the rapid breakthrough that Valens had anticipated. Gothic defenders, fighting from prepared positions and motivated by the knowledge that defeat would mean the destruction of their entire community, maintained disciplined resistance despite suffering heavy casualties from Roman siege engines and missile weapons. The prolonged nature of the fighting allowed Gothic cavalry forces, which had been conducting reconnaissance operations at a distance from the main battlefield, to return and launch devastating attacks against the exposed flanks of Roman formations. The death of Emperor Valens during the final stages of the battle represented a catastrophe of unprecedented magnitude for the Roman Empire, marking the first time since the disaster at Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD that barbarian forces had succeeded in killing a reigning emperor in battle. Contemporary accounts describe the emperor's final moments in conflicting terms, with some sources suggesting he died fighting alongside his bodyguard, while others claim he perished when Gothic warriors set fire to a building where wounded Roman officers had taken refuge. Regardless of the specific circumstances, Valens's death transformed what might have been merely a significant military defeat into a political crisis that threatened the stability of the entire Eastern Empire. The aftermath of Adrianople saw the complete collapse of Roman military authority throughout much of Thrace, with surviving imperial units retreating toward the safety of fortified cities, while Gothic forces resumed their systematic plundering of the countryside. Fritigern, now commanding a victorious army that had demonstrated its ability to defeat the best forces the Empire could deploy, found himself in a position to dictate terms for any future settlement of the conflict. However, the Gothic leader also recognised that his ultimate strategic situation remained precarious, as the resources of the Roman Empire far exceeded those available to his people, and prolonged warfare would inevitably favour the side with superior logistical capabilities and population reserves. The elevation of Theodosius to imperial authority in the eastern provinces during 379 marked the beginning of a new phase in Romano-Gothic relations that would ultimately lead to the integration of significant Gothic populations within the imperial system. Theodosius, whose military experience included successful campaigns against various barbarian peoples along the Danubian frontier, approached the Gothic problem with a combination of military pressure and diplomatic flexibility that gradually wore down Gothic resistance, while offering attractive terms for peaceful settlement. The series of campaigns that Theodosius conducted against Gothic forces between 379 and 382 demonstrated the effectiveness of sustained military pressure combined with efforts to divide Gothic leadership through selective negotiations with individual war leaders. Rather than attempting to achieve decisive victory through a single major battle, Theodosius employed a strategy of gradual attrition that systematically reduced Gothic military capabilities while offering increasingly generous terms to leaders willing to abandon Fritigern's coalition. This approach ultimately succeeded in fragmenting Gothic unity and creating conditions favourable for a comprehensive diplomatic settlement. The final agreements reached between Theodosius and various Gothic leaders during 382 established the framework for Gothic integration into Roman military service that would characterise their relationship with the Empire for the remainder of the 4th century. These arrangements recognised Gothic autonomy in internal affairs while requiring military service under Roman command during imperial campaigns, creating a model that would later be extended to other barbarian peoples seeking accommodation within Roman territories. The fragile peace established between Gothic federates and Roman authorities during the final decades of the 4th century began to unravel as competing factions within both Gothic society and imperial administration pursued conflicting objectives that proved increasingly incompatible. Among the emerging Gothic leaders who challenged the accommodationist policies of their predecessors, none would prove more consequential than Alaric, a young nobleman whose family traced its lineage to the Balti dynasty that had provided leadership to Gothic peoples since their earliest migrations from Scandinavia. Born around 370 AD within the Gothic communities settled in Thrace. Following the agreements negotiated by Theodosius, Alaric came of age during a period when traditional Gothic warrior culture existed in uneasy tension with the requirements of Roman military service. Archaeological evidence from Gothic settlements in the Balkans during this period reveals a society undergoing significant cultural transformation as traditional practices adapted to the realities of life within Roman territorial boundaries. Gothic craftsmen continued producing distinctively decorated metalwork and pottery, but these items increasingly incorporated Roman stylistic elements and manufacturing techniques learned through contact with imperial workshops. The material culture of late 4th century Gothic communities suggests a population that maintained its ethnic identity, while simultaneously absorbing influences from the broader Mediterranean world in which they now participated as federates, rather than external enemies. Alaric's early military experience came through service in Roman campaigns against various barbarian peoples who continued to threaten imperial frontiers during the 380s and 390s. Contemporary sources describe him as commanding Gothic auxiliary units during Theodosius's expedition against the usurper Magnus Maximus in 388, where Gothic cavalry provided crucial support for imperial forces during the decisive engagements in Pannonia. These campaigns offered young Gothic warriors opportunities to observe Roman military organisation firsthand, while gaining experience in the type of large-scale warfare that differed significantly from the tribal conflicts that had characterized their ancestors' martial traditions. The death of Emperor Theodosius in 395 created a succession crisis that fundamentally altered the political dynamics governing Romano-Gothic relations. The division of imperial authority between Theodosius's sons Arcadius and Honorius, who assumed control over the eastern and western portions of the empire respectively, immediately generated competing claims for Gothic military support that Alaric proved adept at exploiting for his own purposes. Rather than maintaining the subordinate role that previous Gothic leaders had accepted within the imperial system, Alaric began asserting independent authority that challenged fundamental assumptions about barbarian integration into Roman political structures. The circumstances surrounding Alaric's elevation to leadership among the Visigothic federates remain obscured by conflicting contemporary accounts that reflect the partisan perspectives of their Roman authors. What seems clear is that his rise occurred during a period of increasing dissatisfaction among Gothic warriors with the terms of their service to imperial authorities. Gothic soldiers complained that promised payments often arrived late or in reduced amounts, while their families in Thrace faced ongoing discrimination from Roman civilians who viewed them as unwelcome foreigners despite their legal status as federates. These grievances provided Alaric with the foundation for challenging existing arrangements and demanding more favourable terms for continued Gothic cooperation with imperial policies. Alaric's initial confrontation with Roman authorities took the form of demands for improved treatment of Gothic federates, rather than outright rebellion against imperial rule. His negotiations with officials representing both Eastern and Western imperial courts during 395 and 396 focused on securing regular payment schedules for Gothic military service, guaranteed food supplies for Gothic civilian communities, and formal recognition of Gothic autonomy in internal affairs. These demands reflected a sophisticated understanding of Roman administrative procedures and legal precedents that suggests Alaric had received education in imperial law and diplomatic protocol during his earlier service as a federate commander. The failure of these diplomatic initiatives to produce satisfactory results led Alaric to adopt increasingly aggressive tactics designed to demonstrate Gothic military capabilities while pressuring imperial authorities to negotiate more seriously. His decision to launch raids into Roman territory during 396 marked a calculated escalation that avoided direct attacks on major population centres while systematically targeting the economic infrastructure that supported imperial tax collection and military recruitment. Gothic forces under Alaric's command struck at undefended estates, merchant convoys and administrative centres throughout Thrace and Macedonia, capturing substantial quantities of gold, silver and other portable wealth that could be used to support continued military operations. The Roman response to these Gothic incursions revealed the extent to which the Empire's military capabilities had deteriorated since the disasters of the previous century. Neither Eastern nor Western imperial authorities possessed sufficient forces to mount effective campaigns against Alaric's mobile columns, which avoided direct confrontation with regular Roman units while maintaining constant pressure on imperial territories. The Gothic leaders' strategy exploited fundamental weaknesses in late Roman military organisation, particularly the Empire's increasing dependence on barbarian federates, whose loyalty remained questionable during periods of political instability. Stilicho, the half-Vandal general who had emerged as the dominant figure in Western imperial politics following Theodosius's death, recognised that Alaric's activities threatened the delicate balance of power that maintained stability throughout the Balkans. His decision to intervene militarily against the Gothic leader reflected both strategic necessity and personal ambition, as success against Alaric would enhance Stilicho's political position while demonstrating Western imperial capabilities to rivals in Constantinople. The general's preparations for campaign against the Visigoths involved assembling a composite army that included regular Roman units, Gallic and Germanic federates, and Hunnic cavalry mercenaries whose mobility could match that of Alaric's forces. The initial confrontation between Stilicho and Alaric occurred in the mountainous terrain of northern Greece during the winter of 396-397, where Gothic forces had established temporary bases while conducting raids against wealthy cities in Thessaly and Boeotia. Stilicho's advance into this region required careful coordination of supply lines that extended across hundreds of kilometres of potentially hostile territory, while Alaric enjoyed the advantage of operating in areas where local populations had been alienated by Roman tax collection and military recruitment policies. The resulting campaign demonstrated the challenges that regular Roman forces faced when attempting to engage enemies who refused to accept battle on conventional terms. Alaric's tactical approach during these confrontations emphasised mobility and deception rather than direct engagement with superior Roman forces. Gothic warbands struck at isolated Roman detachments and supply convoys while avoiding major battles that would expose them to the disciplined formations and siege equipment that remained advantages of imperial military organisation. This strategy proved particularly effective in the broken terrain of central Greece, where narrow mountain passes and dense forests provided numerous opportunities for ambush attacks against Roman columns that were constrained by their heavy equipment and logistical requirements. The siege of Athens during 396 represented Alaric's most ambitious attempt to capture a major Roman city and demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of Gothic military organisation. The ancient city's formidable walls, which had been strengthened with additional fortifications during the 3rd century, proved capable of withstanding Gothic assault techniques that relied primarily on scaling ladders and improvised siege equipment. However, Alaric's forces succeeded in establishing an effective blockade that prevented the delivery of food supplies and reinforcements, creating conditions within the city that gradually weakened the resolve of both military defenders and civilian populations. The eventual Gothic capture of Athens occurred through negotiation rather than military assault, as city officials recognised that continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of their community without achieving meaningful strategic objectives. The terms agreed upon reflected Alaric's desire to maintain his reputation as a reasonable leader who could be trusted to honour diplomatic agreements, while also providing his forces with the substantial quantities of gold and silver necessary to maintain their loyalty during an extended campaign. Contemporary accounts describe the Gothic occupation of Athens as relatively restrained, with significant monuments and public buildings remaining intact despite the systematic plundering of private wealth and government treasuries. The success of Alaric's Greek expedition established his reputation as a military commander, capable of achieving objectives that had eluded other barbarian leaders, while simultaneously demonstrating the vulnerability of Roman territories to well-organised Gothic attacks. News of the fall of Athens spread rapidly throughout the eastern Mediterranean, encouraging other barbarian peoples to consider similar aggressive actions against imperial authorities while undermining confidence in Roman military capabilities among both allied peoples and potential enemies. The psychological impact of these Gothic victories proved as significant as their immediate material consequences in shaping subsequent developments in Romano-barbarian relations. Stilicho's eventual intervention in Greece during 397 forced Alaric to abandon his conquest in Attica and retreat toward the Adriatic coast, but the Roman general's success proved temporary and incomplete. The Gothic leader had demonstrated his ability to conduct extended military operations deep within Roman territory, while maintaining the cohesion and morale of his forces under difficult conditions. More importantly, Alaric had established direct diplomatic contact with officials representing both Eastern and Western imperial courts, creating opportunities for future negotiations that would allow him to play competing Roman factions against each other for maximum advantage. The complex diplomatic maneuvering that characterized Alaric's relationship with imperial authorities during the final years of the 4th century reflected his sophisticated understanding of Roman political dynamics and his ability to exploit the rivalry between Eastern and Western courts for Gothic benefit. His negotiations with Arcadius's representatives in Constantinople during 397 and 398 focused on securing formal recognition of his authority over Visigothic federates in exchange for military service against Western imperial forces, while simultaneously maintaining contact with Stilicho's agents who offered alternative arrangements that would place Gothic forces under Western command. This diplomatic flexibility allowed Alaric to avoid decisive commitment to either side while extracting concessions from both imperial courts. The appointment of Alaric to the position of Magister Militum per Illyricum by Eastern imperial authorities in 398 represented a remarkable transformation in his official status within the Roman system. This promotion, which granted him command authority over regular Roman military units, in addition to his existing control over Gothic federates, reflected Arcadius's determination to secure Gothic support against potential Western intervention in Eastern territories. The appointment also provided Alaric with legal justification for his continued military activities, as his operations could now be characterized as legitimate imperial campaigns rather than barbarian raids against Roman territory. However, Alaric's new official position created as many problems as it solved, particularly in his relationship with Gothic warriors who had followed him based on traditional bonds of personal loyalty rather than Roman concepts of military hierarchy. The integration of Gothic forces into regular Roman command structures required modifications to traditional Germanic military practices that some warriors found unacceptable, while the bureaucratic requirements of Roman military administration conflicted with the informal decision-making processes that had characterized Gothic leadership since their earliest tribal organization. These tensions would continue to influence Alaric's strategic choices throughout his subsequent career as he attempted to balance competing demands from Roman superiors and Gothic subordinates. The outbreak of renewed conflict between Alaric and Western imperial forces during 401 resulted from the complex interaction of several factors that made peaceful coexistence increasingly difficult to maintain. Stilicho's growing influence over Western imperial policy included plans for reasserting Roman control over territories in the Balkans that had been effectively ceded to Eastern authority during the previous decade, while Alaric's position as the Eastern Magister Militum required him to defend these same territories against Western encroachment. The personal animosity that had developed between the two commanders during their earlier confrontations in Greece added an additional element of instability to an already volatile situation. Alaric's decision to launch his first major invasion of Italy during the spring of 401 represented a calculated escalation designed to force Western imperial authorities to negotiate more favourable terms for Gothic participation in Roman political arrangements. Rather than attempting to conquer and occupy Italian territories, the Gothic leader's strategy focused on demonstrating his military capabilities while avoiding actions that would make future diplomatic accommodation impossible. His forces crossed the Julian Alps through passes that had been used by previous barbarian invaders, including the Cimbrian Teutones, whose campaigns during the late 2nd century BC had established precedents for successful barbarian operations in northern Italy. The initial Gothic advance into the Po Valley encountered minimal Roman resistance, as Stilicho's forces remained concentrated around Milan and other major cities while attempting to determine Alaric's ultimate objectives. Gothic columns systematically plundered the countryside throughout Venetia and Liguria, capturing livestock, grain stores and other supplies necessary to support continued military operations, while avoiding direct attacks on fortified positions that would require extended siege operations. This strategy maximised Gothic mobility, while minimising casualties that Alaric could not easily replace during a campaign conducted far from his primary recruiting grounds in the Balkans. The siege of Aquileia during the summer of 401 demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Gothic military capabilities when confronted with serious Roman defensive preparations. The ancient city's massive walls, which had been constructed during the 2nd century AD and subsequently strengthened with additional fortifications, proved capable of withstanding Gothic assault techniques that relied primarily on direct attacks supported by improvised siege equipment. However, Alaric's forces succeeded in establishing an effective blockade that prevented the delivery of supplies and reinforcements, creating conditions within the city that gradually weakened both military and civilian morale. Stilicho's relief of Aquileia during late 401 marked the beginning of a series of military confrontations that would test both commanders' tactical abilities and strategic judgment. The Roman general's approach to the besieged city required careful coordination of multiple army columns, advancing through terrain that favoured defensive operations, while Alaric faced the difficult choice between abandoning his siege operations or risking a major battle against superior Roman forces. The eventual Gothic withdrawal from Aquileia occurred under cover of darkness, allowing Alaric to preserve the majority of his forces while avoiding the type of decisive engagement that might have ended his Italian campaign prematurely. The Battle of Pollentia, fought on Easter Sunday, April 6, 402, represented the first major field engagement between Alaric's Gothic forces and Stilicho's Western Roman army during the Italian campaigns. The encounter occurred near the confluence of the Tanaro and Po rivers, where Alaric had established a fortified camp while attempting to determine Stilicho's movements and intentions. The battle's timing on Christianity's most sacred holiday created additional complications for both commanders, as many of their soldiers observed religious restrictions that limited their willingness to engage in combat during the Easter celebration. The Gothic victory at Pollentia had established Alaric's reputation as a formidable military commander, but the strategic situation facing his people remained fundamentally precarious. Despite their battlefield successes against Roman forces, the Visigoths controlled no permanent territories and possessed no secure base from which to conduct extended campaigns. The death of Alaric during the siege of Cosenza in 410 created an immediate succession crisis that threatened to fragment the Gothic confederation he had assembled through 2 decades of careful political manoeuvring and military leadership. The selection of his brother-in-law Athalf as the new Gothic king represented a deliberate choice by tribal leaders who sought continuity with Alaric's policies, while recognising the need for fresh approaches to the challenges confronting their people. Atholf inherited command of approximately 40,000 Gothic warriors and their families, a substantial force that nonetheless remained vulnerable to the superior resources that Rome could deploy once imperial authorities resolved their internal political conflicts. Unlike his predecessor, who had focused primarily on extracting concessions from Roman officials through military pressure, Athalf demonstrated greater interest in achieving permanent territorial settlement that would provide his people with the agricultural base necessary for long-term survival. His strategic vision encompassed the establishment of an independent Gothic kingdom within former Roman territories, but one that would maintain cooperative relationships with imperial authorities rather than existing in perpetual hostility to Roman interests. The new Gothic leader's first major decision involved relocating his entire people from Italy to southern Gaul, a migration that began during the winter of 412 and extended through the following spring. This movement represented one of the largest organised population transfers of the early 5th century, requiring coordination of logistics that included transport for non-combatants, livestock herds, and the accumulated wealth that Gothic forces had gathered during their Italian campaigns. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Gothic migration route reveals temporary encampments that could accommodate thousands of individuals, with defensive earthworks and organised waste disposal systems that demonstrate sophisticated planning capabilities. The Gothic crossing of the Alps occurred through passes that had been used by Roman armies during the conquest of Gaul centuries earlier, but the winter conditions encountered by Athalf's people created hardships that tested the cohesion of the Gothic Confederation. Contemporary sources describe severe weather that resulted in significant casualties among elderly individuals and young children, while the loss of livestock to cold and inadequate fodder threatened the economic foundation upon which Gothic society depended. These difficulties reinforced Athalf's determination to secure permanent settlement arrangements that would eliminate the need for future migrations under similarly adverse conditions. The initial Gothic settlements in Narbonensis during 413 established a pattern of occupation that would characterise Visigothic territorial organisation for the remainder of the 5th century. Rather than displacing existing Roman landowners entirely, Athalf's followers implemented a system of shared control that allowed continued agricultural production while providing Gothic warriors with the resources necessary to maintain their military effectiveness. Roman estate owners retained portions of their properties in exchange for supplying agreed-upon quantities of grain, wine, and other agricultural products to Gothic administrators, while Gothic families received designated parcels of land that they could cultivate using traditional farming techniques adapted to Mediterranean environmental conditions. The administrative challenges involved in governing a mixed Roman Gothic population required Athalf to develop new institutional arrangements that could accommodate the legal traditions and cultural practices of both communities. Gothic customary law, which emphasised personal honour and collective responsibility for maintaining social order, proved difficult to reconcile with Roman legal principles that relied on written statutes and bureaucratic procedures. The compromise solutions that emerged during this period established precedents for the legal pluralism that would characterise Visigothic governance throughout their subsequent history in both Gaul and Spain. Athalf's marriage to Galla Placidia during a lavish ceremony at Narbonne in January 414 represented both a personal alliance and a calculated political strategy designed to legitimise Gothic rule within former Roman territories. Galla Placidia, sister of Emperor Honorius and daughter of Theodosius the Great, had been captured during the Gothic sack of Rome in 410 and had remained with Alaric's forces during their subsequent campaigns in Italy. Her elevated social status and direct connection to the Theodosian dynasty made her an invaluable asset for any barbarian leader seeking recognition from Roman authorities, while her intelligence and political acumen provided Athalf with sophisticated advice regarding imperial court politics. The wedding ceremony itself reflected Athalf's desire to demonstrate Gothic cultural sophistication, while respecting Roman aristocratic traditions that would enhance his bride's acceptance of their union. Contemporary accounts describe celebrations that lasted for several days and included both Gothic warrior rituals and Roman ceremonial elements, with gifts presented to the couple that included precious metals, silk textiles, and exotic spices obtained through Mediterranean trade networks. The presence of Roman officials at the ceremony indicated growing acceptance of Gothic political authority among local administrators who recognised the practical necessity of accommodation with their new rulers. The birth of Theodosius, named after Galla Placidia's father, during the summer of 414 appeared to provide Atulf with the dynastic foundation necessary for establishing a lasting Gothic kingdom in southern Gaul. The infant's mixed Gothic-Roman heritage symbolised the cultural synthesis that Atulf envisioned for his realm, while his imperial lineage offered potential legitimacy for future claims to broader authority within the former Roman territories. However, the child's death during his first year eliminated these dynastic possibilities and contributed to growing tensions within Gothic leadership regarding the direction of Atulf's policies. The Gothic occupation of Barcelona during 415 marked a significant expansion of Visigothic territorial control into the Iberian Peninsula, where Roman authority had been weakened by ongoing conflicts with Vandal and Suevi invaders who had crossed the Pyrenees during the previous decade. Atulf's decision to establish his court in this prosperous Mediterranean city reflected his recognition that Gothic long-term survival required access to the commercial networks and urban resources that characterized the most economically developed regions of the former Western Empire. The city's excellent harbour facilities and established connections with North African and Eastern Mediterranean markets provided opportunities for Gothic participation in international trade that could supplement the agricultural resources of their Gallic territories. The assassination of Atulf during the late summer of 415 occurred under circumstances that remain disputed among contemporary sources, though most accounts attribute his death to a conspiracy involving Gothic nobles who opposed his pro-Roman policies and his marriage to an imperial princess. The assassin, identified as Dubius or Sigeric in various sources, appears to have acted with the support of a faction that favoured more aggressive policies toward Roman authorities and rejected the accommodationist approach that had characterised Atulf's reign. The murder took place in Barcelona's royal residence, where the Gothic king was reportedly examining horses in the palace stables when his attacker struck him down with a sword thrust that proved immediately fatal. The brief reign of Sigeric, who assumed Gothic leadership following Atulf's assassination, demonstrated the instability that could result when barbarian kingdoms lacked clear succession mechanisms and faced significant internal divisions regarding fundamental policy questions. Sigeric's attempts to reverse his predecessor's pro-Roman orientation included the public humiliation of Galla Placidia, who was forced to walk 12 miles on foot alongside other Roman captives in a ceremony designed to demonstrate Gothic rejection of accommodation with imperial authorities. However, these provocative actions alienated moderate Gothic leaders who recognised that continued hostility towards Rome would ultimately prove self-destructive for their people. The murder of Sigeric after only 7 days in power reflected the rapid crystallization of opposition to his policies among Gothic nobles who had initially supported Atulf's assassination, but now recognised the dangers inherent in completely abandoning diplomatic relationships with Roman authorities. The circumstances of Sigeric's death mirror those of his predecessor, with contemporary sources describing another palace conspiracy that eliminated the anti-Roman king before his policies could cause irreparable damage to Gothic interests. The speed with which these events unfolded indicates the volatile nature of Gothic internal politics during this crucial period in their early history as a settled people. The elevation of Valia to Gothic leadership in late 415 represented a return to the pragmatic policies that had characterised Atulf's reign. Though the new king demonstrated greater caution in his approach to Roman negotiations and avoided the personal commitments that had made his predecessor vulnerable to criticism from traditionalist factions, Wallia's background included extensive military experience during the Italian campaigns under Alaric, but he had also observed the administrative challenges that Atholf had faced while attempting to govern settled territories with limited institutional resources. His leadership style emphasized consultation with tribal councils and careful attention to maintaining consensus among competing Gothic interest groups. The negotiations that led to the establishment of the Visigothic Kingdom of Toulouse in 418 required complex diplomatic manoeuvring that addressed the concerns of multiple parties while creating a framework for long-term stability in southwestern Gaul. Emperor Honorius, advised by his Magister Militum Constantius, recognised that Gothic military capabilities could serve imperial interests if properly channelled against other barbarian peoples who threatened Roman territories in Spain and elsewhere. The Goths, for their part, sought formal recognition of their territorial claims and guarantees that Roman authorities would not attempt to dislodge them from lands they had occupied through conquest and settlement. The Foedus Agreement signed between Wallia and Honorius established the legal foundation for Visigothic rule over territories that included much of Aquitaine, with Toulouse serving as the kingdom's capital and administrative centre. The treaty's provisions required Gothic military service on behalf of imperial interests, particularly in campaigns against Vandals, Alans and Suevi, who had established themselves in various parts of the Iberian Peninsula following their crossing of the Rhine frontier in 406. In exchange, the Visigoths received formal recognition of their territorial sovereignty and the right to collect taxes from Roman populations within their designated boundaries. The territorial boundaries established for the early Visigothic kingdom encompassed approximately 40,000 square kilometres of some of the most fertile and economically productive land in Gaul. The region's Mediterranean climate supported extensive viticulture and olive cultivation, while the river valleys of the Garonne and its tributaries provided excellent conditions for grain production and livestock grazing. Archaeological surveys of rural sites within these territories reveal evidence of continued agricultural production during the transition from Roman to Gothic control, suggesting that the change in political authority did not significantly disrupt existing economic systems. The Gothic settlement pattern that emerged during the early years of the Toulouse kingdom reflected both practical considerations regarding military security and cultural preferences that had developed during their previous migrations. Gothic nobles typically established their residences on elevated sites that provided defensive advantages while offering commanding views of surrounding agricultural lands, often incorporating elements of Roman villa architecture with traditional Germanic building techniques. These compounds usually included residential quarters for extended family groups, workshops for skilled craftsmen, storage facilities for agricultural surpluses, and stables for the horses that remained central to Gothic military organisation. The integration of Roman administrative practices with Gothic customary law created a distinctive governmental system that would influence political development throughout the former Western Empire during the 5th and 6th centuries. Wallia retained Roman tax collection mechanisms while adapting them to Gothic concepts of military service and personal loyalty, creating hybrid institutions that could function effectively in a society where traditional tribal relationships coexisted with territorial governance requirements. The king's court at Toulouse attracted both Gothic nobles and Roman aristocrats who recognised opportunities for advancement within the new political system. The military campaigns that Wallia conducted in Spain between 416 and 418 fulfilled the terms of the Foedus Agreement, while establishing Visigothic influence in regions that would later become central to their kingdom's territorial expansion. Gothic forces systematically attacked Vandal settlements in Baetica, capturing substantial quantities of gold and silver while eliminating a potential threat to Roman interests in southern Spain. These operations demonstrated Gothic military effectiveness against other barbarian peoples, while providing valuable experience in the type of territorial warfare that differed significantly from the mobile campaigns that had characterized their earlier history. The conflict with the Suevi in northwestern Spain proved more challenging than the anti-Vandal operations, as these Germanic peoples had established more secure territorial bases and developed effective defensive strategies adapted to the mountainous terrain of Galicia. Gothic forces under Vallia's personal command achieved several significant victories against Suevi armies, but the difficult logistics of maintaining extended campaigns in regions far from Gothic supply bases prevented complete elimination of Suevi political authority. The compromise arrangements that eventually ended this conflict established boundaries between Gothic and Suevi spheres of influence that would persist for several decades. The death of Wallia in 418, shortly after the conclusion of the Spanish campaigns and the formal establishment of the Toulouse kingdom, created another succession crisis that tested the stability of the newly established political arrangements. However, the institutional foundations that had been developed during his brief but consequential reign proved sufficiently robust to survive the transition to his successor Theodoric, who would rule the Visigothic kingdom for the next 33 years and oversee its transformation into one of the most powerful political entities in post-Roman Europe. The accession of Theodoric I to the Visigothic throne in 418 marked the beginning of a transformative period that would see the consolidation of Gothic power across southwestern Gaul and the establishment of institutional frameworks capable of governing a complex multi-ethnic kingdom. Unlike his predecessors, who had ruled primarily through personal charisma and military success, Theodoric inherited a realm with defined territorial boundaries, formal diplomatic relationships with imperial authorities, and administrative systems that required sophisticated management skills. The new king's background included extensive experience in both military command and civil administration during Wallia's reign, providing him with practical knowledge of the challenges involved in governing settled populations, while maintaining the martial traditions that remained central to Gothic identity. The territorial extent of the Visigothic kingdom at the time of Theodoric's accession encompassed roughly 45,000 square kilometres, stretching from the Loire River in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, with the Atlantic coast forming the western boundary and the Rhone Valley marking the eastern limits of Gothic authority. This substantial domain included some of the most economically productive regions of Gaul, with extensive agricultural lands, established urban centres, and well-developed transportation networks that connected the kingdom to broader Mediterranean commercial systems. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout these territories reveals continued prosperity during the early decades of Gothic rule, with Roman villa complexes maintaining their agricultural functions while adapting to new ownership patterns and administrative requirements. Theodoric's approach to governance emphasized the systematic integration of Roman administrative practices with Gothic customary law, creating hybrid institutions that could effectively manage the diverse populations within his kingdom. The king established his primary court at Toulouse, transforming the former Roman administrative centre into a Gothic capital that attracted nobles, merchants, and craftsmen from throughout southwestern Europe. The royal residence incorporated elements of both Roman palatial architecture and traditional Germanic great halls, featuring extensive reception areas for diplomatic ceremonies, private quarters for the royal family, and workshops where skilled artisans produced the luxury goods that served as symbols of royal authority and diplomatic gifts for foreign rulers. The military organisation that Theodoric developed during the early years of his reign reflected the kingdom's dual requirements for internal security and external defence against various threats that continued to challenge Visigothic territorial integrity. The core of Gothic military strength remained the traditional warrior bands that had followed Alaric and his successors during their migrations, but these forces now required adaptation to the demands of territorial defence rather than mobile campaigning. Theodoric established a network of fortified positions throughout his kingdom, often utilising existing Roman fortifications that were modified to accommodate Gothic tactical preferences and equipped with supplies necessary to withstand extended sieges. The Gothic warrior class that formed the backbone of Theodoric's military system maintained their traditional emphasis on individual combat skills and personal loyalty to their commanders, but they also adapted to new tactical requirements that emphasise coordinated operations and siege warfare. Archaeological excavations at Gothic military sites reveal evidence of sophisticated weapons production, including pattern-welded swords of exceptional quality and composite bows that incorporated techniques learned from Hunnic and other steppe peoples encountered during their earlier migrations. The integration of Roman siege equipment and engineering techniques with Gothic mobility and fighting spirit created military capabilities that proved highly effective against various enemies who challenged Visigothic territorial claims. The administrative system that evolved under Theodoric's rule demonstrated remarkable sophistication in its ability to manage the complex legal and cultural relationships that characterized a kingdom where Gothic nobles, Roman aristocrats, and various other ethnic groups coexisted within shared territorial boundaries. The king retained Roman tax collection mechanisms while adapting them to Gothic concepts of military service and personal obligation, creating revenue systems that could support both civil administration and military operations, without placing excessive burdens on agricultural populations. Gothic customary law continued to govern relationships among tribal members, while Roman legal principles applied to disputes involving Roman citizens and commercial transactions that required standardized procedures. The economic foundations of the Toulouse kingdom rested primarily on agricultural production that took advantage of the region's favourable climate and fertile soils to generate surpluses capable of supporting substantial non-agricultural populations. The river valleys of the Garonne, Dordogne and their tributaries provided excellent conditions for grain cultivation, while the hillsides throughout Aquitaine supported extensive vineyards that produced wines highly valued in both local and international markets. Archaeological analysis of rural settlements reveals evidence of technological improvements during the early Gothic period, including more efficient ploughing techniques and crop rotation systems that increased agricultural productivity while maintaining soil fertility over extended periods. The urban centres within Theodoric's kingdom experienced significant growth during the first decades of Gothic rule, as political stability and economic prosperity attracted merchants, craftsmen, and other specialists who contributed to increasingly complex commercial networks. Toulouse itself grew from a modest Roman administrative centre into a major European capital, with population estimates suggesting growth from approximately 15,000 inhabitants in 418 to over 30,000 by the 440s. The city's expansion required substantial infrastructure development, including new residential districts, expanded market areas, and improved water supply systems that utilised both Roman engineering techniques and Gothic organisational capabilities. The diplomatic relationships that Theodoric maintained with various neighbouring powers reflected his sophisticated understanding of the complex political dynamics that characterised 5th century Europe, where the collapse of effective Roman authority had created opportunities for ambitious rulers while also generating numerous sources of potential conflict. The king's correspondence with imperial officials in both Ravenna and Constantinople demonstrated his continued recognition of nominal Roman sovereignty, while asserting practical independence in matters affecting Visigothic territorial interests. These diplomatic contacts proved particularly valuable in securing formal recognition of Gothic territorial claims and obtaining imperial support for military operations against common enemies. The relationship between the Visigothic kingdom and the remnants of Roman authority in Gaul required careful management of competing interests and conflicting loyalties that could easily have destabilised the entire region. Theodoric maintained cooperative relationships with Roman generals such as Aetius, who recognised that Gothic military capabilities could serve imperial interests when properly coordinated with broader strategic objectives. The two leaders collaborated effectively in campaigns against various barbarian peoples who threatened both Gothic territories and remaining Roman provinces, establishing patterns of military cooperation that would continue throughout Theodoric's reign despite occasional tensions over territorial boundaries and administrative jurisdiction. The growing threat posed by Hunnic expansion under Attila's leadership during the 440s created new challenges that tested both Theodoric's diplomatic skills and the military capabilities of his kingdom. Intelligence reports reaching Toulouse described the systematic consolidation of Hunnic authority over various Germanic and other peoples throughout Central and Eastern Europe, with Attila's forces demonstrating unprecedented organisational capabilities and military effectiveness. The Hunnic Confederation's expansion toward Western Europe threatened not only Visigothic territorial integrity, but also the broader balance of power that had maintained relative stability throughout Gaul since the establishment of the various barbarian kingdoms. Theodoric's response to the Hunnic threat involved both military preparations and diplomatic initiatives designed to create alliances capable of resisting Attila's expansion. The king ordered the strengthening of fortifications throughout his kingdom, while simultaneously expanding military recruitment to increase the number of warriors available for potential campaigns. Gothic diplomatic missions travelled to courts throughout Western Europe, seeking to coordinate resistance efforts with other rulers who recognised the existential threat posed by Hunnic expansion. These negotiations proved particularly challenging because many potential allies harboured territorial ambitions that conflicted with Visigothic interests, requiring careful balance between immediate security needs and long-term political objectives. The military reforms that Theodoric implemented during the late 440s reflected lessons learned from intelligence reports regarding Hunnic tactical capabilities and organisational methods. Gothic forces began incorporating larger numbers of archers into their traditional infantry formations, while cavalry units received additional training in the type of mobile warfare that characterised steppe military traditions. The king also established improved communication systems throughout his kingdom, utilising mounted messengers and signal fires to ensure rapid transmission of intelligence regarding enemy movements and coordination of defensive responses. The culmination of these preparations came with Attila's massive invasion of Gaul during 451, when Hunnic forces crossed the Rhine with an army estimated by contemporary sources at over 300,000 warriors, drawn from dozens of different peoples who had been incorporated into the Hunnic Confederation through conquest or alliance. The initial Hunnic advance proceeded with devastating effectiveness, overwhelming Roman and Frankish resistance in northeastern Gaul, while systematically destroying urban centres and agricultural resources that could support continued opposition. News of these victories reached Toulouse through refugee populations and military scouts, providing Theodoric with detailed information regarding Hunnic tactical methods and strategic objectives. The decision to join the coalition army assembled by Aetius represented one of the most consequential choices of Theodoric's reign, requiring him to commit the majority of his military forces to a campaign whose outcome would determine the future of Western Europe. The king recognised that Hunnic victory would inevitably result in the destruction of the Visigothic kingdom, while successful resistance offered opportunities for territorial expansion and enhanced political influence within the post-Roman world. The Gothic military contribution to the Allied forces included approximately 25,000 warriors, representing the largest single contingent among the various peoples who rallied to oppose Attila's invasion. The march of Gothic forces from Toulouse to the rendezvous point with Aetius's army required careful coordination of logistics and route planning to ensure that Theodoric's warriors arrived in fighting condition despite the considerable distances involved. The king personally led this expedition, accompanied by several of his sons and the most experienced Gothic commanders, while leaving sufficient forces in Aquitaine to maintain internal security and defend against potential secondary attacks. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Gothic march route reveals temporary encampments that demonstrate sophisticated organisational capabilities, with defensive earthworks, organised waste disposal, and systematic arrangements for feeding and equipping large numbers of warriors and their horses. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, fought on June 20th, 451, near the modern city of Châlons-en-Champagne, represented one of the largest military engagements in European history and determined the fate of Hunnic expansion into Western Europe. The opposing armies deployed across a vast plain that provided adequate space for the complex tactical manoeuvres that characterise this massive confrontation between fundamentally different military traditions. Attila's forces occupied elevated positions that offered defensive advantages while allowing Hunnic cavalry maximum flexibility for their preferred hit-and-run tactics, while the allied army under Aetius arranged itself in a formation that maximised the strengths of its diverse contingents while minimising potential coordination problems among forces that had never previously fought together. Theodoric positioned his Gothic warriors on the allied right wing, where their traditional fighting methods and equipment proved most suitable for the type of direct confrontation that developed during the battle's crucial phases. The Gothic king wore distinctive armour that included a mail hauberk reinforced with bronze scales, a conical helmet decorated with precious metals, and carried weapons that symbolised both his royal authority and personal martial prowess. His presence at the front of Gothic battle lines provided inspiration for his warriors while demonstrating the personal leadership style that had characterised his entire reign. The initial phases of the battle involved extensive cavalry skirmishing as both sides attempted to gain tactical advantages through reconnaissance and harassment of enemy formations. Hunnic horse archers proved particularly effective during these preliminary engagements, using their superior mobility and composite bow technology to inflict casualties on allied forces while avoiding decisive contact with heavier cavalry units that could exploit their advantages in close combat. The Gothic cavalry, trained in traditional Germanic fighting methods but adapted to Roman tactical concepts, demonstrated remarkable discipline in maintaining formation integrity despite suffering significant losses from Hunnic archery. The decisive moment of the battle occurred during the late afternoon when coordinated attacks by Allied infantry forces succeeded in breaking through Hunnic defensive positions and threatening Attila's command centre. Theodoric personally led the Gothic charge that contributed to this breakthrough, wielding his sword with the skill that had made him legendary among his warriors, while shouting encouragement to his followers in the traditional Gothic war cries that had echoed across battlefields from the Black Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. The intensity of combat during this phase resulted in unprecedented casualties on both sides, with contemporary sources describing the battlefield as covered with the bodies of warriors from dozens of different peoples who had travelled vast distances to participate in this climactic confrontation. The death of Theodoric I at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains created an immediate succession crisis that threatened to fragment the Visigothic kingdom at precisely the moment when unified leadership was most essential for survival. The Gothic warriors who had witnessed their king's heroic death on the battlefield faced the dual challenge of completing their military obligations to the anti-Hunnic coalition, while simultaneously selecting new leadership capable of guiding their people through the turbulent period that would inevitably follow Attila's defeat. The traditional Gothic assembly that convened in the immediate aftermath of the battle chose Thorismund, Theodoric's eldest son, who had distinguished himself during the fighting and possessed both the martial credentials and political connections necessary to maintain the kingdom's territorial integrity. Thorismund's brief reign, lasting only 2 years until his assassination in 453, demonstrated the continuing instability that characterized Visigothic internal politics despite the external success achieved at the Catalonian plains. The new king's aggressive policies toward neighbouring peoples, including renewed conflicts with Roman authorities in southern Gaul and territorial disputes with Burgundian settlements along the Rhone valley, alienated moderate Gothic nobles who preferred the more cautious diplomatic approach that had characterized his father's later years. Archaeological evidence from Gothic settlements during this period reveals signs of economic disruption, with reduced trade activity and decreased agricultural production, indicating the destabilizing effects of constant military mobilization and political uncertainty. The elevation of Theodoric II following his brother's murder marked a return to the pragmatic policies that had enabled the Visigothic kingdom to prosper during the previous 3 decades, but the new king inherited a significantly more challenging strategic environment than his predecessors had faced. The collapse of effective Roman authority throughout much of Gaul had created a power vacuum that various Germanic peoples sought to fill through territorial expansion, while the emergence of Frankish power under increasingly capable leaders posed a direct threat to Visigothic dominance in southwestern France. Theodoric II's diplomatic correspondence with officials in both Ravenna and Constantinople reveals his sophisticated understanding of these complex political dynamics and his determination to maintain Gothic independence while adapting to changing circumstances. The Frankish expansion under Childeric I during the 460s represented the beginning of sustained pressure on Visigothic territories that would eventually prove decisive in determining the fate of the Toulouse kingdom. Unlike previous Frankish leaders, who had focused primarily on consolidating control over territories in northeastern Gaul, Childeric demonstrated strategic vision that encompassed systematic expansion southward toward the economically valuable regions controlled by the Visigoths. Frankish military organisation had evolved considerably since their initial settlement in Roman territories, incorporating tactical innovations learned through contact with various other Germanic peoples while maintaining the aggressive warrior culture that had characterized their society since their earliest migrations across the Rhine. The Frankish military advantages that would prove crucial in their eventual victory over the Visigoths included superior numbers, more secure territorial bases, and increasingly effective coordination between different tribal groups that had previously operated independently. Archaeological analysis of Frankish weapon deposits from this period reveals technological improvements that enhanced their battlefield effectiveness, including longer swords with improved metallurgy, more sophisticated shield construction, and the adoption of cavalry techniques that increased their tactical flexibility. The Frankish emphasis on infantry combat, supported by growing numbers of mounted warriors, created military capabilities particularly well suited to the type of territorial warfare that characterized conflicts in 5th century Gaul. Clovis' accession to Frankish leadership around 481 transformed what had been gradual territorial pressure into systematic conquest campaigns that threatened the very existence of the Visigothic kingdom. The new Frankish king combined exceptional military skills with sophisticated political intelligence that enabled him to exploit divisions among his enemies while building coalitions capable of achieving decisive strategic objectives. His early campaigns against various Roman enclaves in northern Gaul demonstrated tactical innovations that incorporated lessons learned from previous Frankish defeats, while his diplomatic initiatives succeeded in securing alliances with Burgundian and other Germanic leaders who had previously remained neutral in conflicts between Franks and Visigoths. The religious dimension of Clovis's challenge to Visigothic authority added ideological complexity to what might otherwise have remained purely territorial conflicts between competing Germanic kingdoms. The Frankish king's conversion to Catholic Christianity around 496 provided him with powerful support from Roman ecclesiastical authorities who viewed Arian Visigoths as heretical enemies of Orthodox faith. This religious alliance proved particularly valuable in securing the loyalty of Roman populations within territories that Clovis conquered, as local bishops actively supported Frankish rule while encouraging resistance to continued Visigothic authority. The ideological framework that emerged from this religious conflict transformed military campaigns into crusades that attracted support from throughout Catholic Europe. Alaric II, who succeeded his father Theodoric II in 484, inherited a kingdom facing unprecedented external pressures, while simultaneously dealing with internal divisions that weakened Gothic resistance to Frankish expansion. The new king's reign coincided with a period of increasing religious persecution, directed against Catholic populations within Visigothic territories, as Arian bishops sought to strengthen their theological position through aggressive enforcement of doctrinal uniformity. These policies alienated significant portions of the kingdom's Roman population, creating potential fifth columns that could support Frankish invasion when military campaigns eventually commenced. The deteriorating military situation facing the Visigothic kingdom during the final decades of the 5th century reflected both external pressures and internal weaknesses that Alaric II proved unable to address effectively. Gothic military recruitment had declined as prolonged warfare reduced the warrior population, while economic disruption caused by constant military mobilization undermined the agricultural foundation that supported the kingdom's military capabilities. Archaeological evidence from Gothic fortifications dating to this period shows hasty repairs and modifications that suggest desperate attempts to maintain defensive positions with inadequate resources and manpower. The diplomatic isolation that characterized Alaric II's position during the early years of the 6th century resulted from Clovis's successful efforts to neutralize potential Visigothic allies through a combination of military pressure and political agreements. The Burgundian kingdom, which had previously maintained neutral relations with both Franks and Visigoths, gradually shifted toward alliance with Clovis as Frankish military successes demonstrated the probable outcome of the broader conflict. Ostrogothic support for their Visigothic cousins remained limited to diplomatic protests and occasional military assistance that proved insufficient to alter the fundamental balance of power in Gaul. The outbreak of open warfare between Franks and Visigoths in 506 occurred when Clovis finally possessed sufficient military strength and political support to launch the comprehensive conquest campaign that would eliminate Visigothic power in Gaul permanently. The Frankish king's preparations for this decisive conflict included diplomatic negotiations that secured Burgundian neutrality while preventing significant Ostrogothic intervention on behalf of their Visigothic allies. Archaeological evidence from Frankish military sites dating to this period reveals extensive weapons production and supply accumulation that indicates systematic preparation for extended campaigning rather than the limited raids that had characterized earlier conflicts. The initial Frankish advance into Visigothic territory proceeded with devastating effectiveness, as Clovis's forces systematically captured fortified positions that had anchored Gothic defensive strategies for decades. The siege techniques that Frankish armies employed demonstrated significant improvements over previous Germanic military capabilities, incorporating Roman engineering knowledge with innovative approaches to overcoming defensive obstacles. Gothic resistance proved sporadic and poorly coordinated, reflecting both the kingdom's military weaknesses and the psychological impact of facing enemies who enjoyed overwhelming advantages in numbers and resources. The Battle of Vuil, fought in 507s near Poitiers, represented the culmination of Frankish expansion and the effective end of Visigothic power in Gaul. The engagement occurred on terrain that favoured neither side decisively, with both armies deploying across rolling plains that provided adequate space for the cavalry manoeuvres that had become increasingly important in Germanic warfare. Alaric II personally commanded the Visigothic forces, wearing the royal armour that had been crafted for his grandfather Theodoric I, and carrying weapons that symbolised dynastic continuity dating back to the great migrations of the previous century. The tactical development of the battle reflected the fundamental differences in military organisation and strategic objectives that distinguished Frankish and Visigothic approaches to warfare. Clovis deployed his forces in a formation that maximised Frankish advantages in infantry combat, while utilising cavalry units to exploit breakthrough opportunities and pursue retreating enemies. The Visigothic army, significantly outnumbered and lacking the tactical cohesion that had characterised their ancestors' victories, attempted to compensate for numerical disadvantages through aggressive attacks designed to disrupt Frankish formations before they could achieve decisive concentration of force. The death of Alaric II during the battle's climactic phase occurred when the Visigothic king led a desperate cavalry charge aimed at breaking through Frankish lines and reaching Clovis's command position. Contemporary sources describe the encounter between the two monarchs as a single combat that epitomised the personal nature of early medieval kingship, with both rulers wielding weapons with exceptional skill while their respective followers watched the confrontation that would determine their people's fates. The Frankish king's victory in this duel, achieved through a spear thrust that penetrated Alaric's mail armour, immediately demoralised Visigothic resistance and precipitated the collapse of organised Gothic military opposition. The immediate aftermath of Vouilly saw the rapid disintegration of Visigothic authority throughout most of Gaul, as Frankish forces systematically occupied major cities, while Gothic nobles fled southward with whatever portable wealth they could salvage from their estates. The speed of this collapse reflected not only military defeat, but also the erosion of popular support that had occurred during the preceding decades of religious persecution and economic decline. Archaeological evidence from abandoned Visigothic settlements reveals signs of hasty evacuation, with valuable items left behind and agricultural equipment abandoned in fields, indicating the panic that accompanied the kingdom's final collapse. The massive population movement that followed the Gothic defeat at Vouilly represented one of the largest organised migrations in European history, as virtually the entire Visigothic nobility and substantial portions of the warrior class abandoned their Gallic territories in favour of seeking refuge in Spain. This exodus included not only military personnel but also craftsmen, merchants, and other specialists whose skills would be essential for re-establishing Gothic civilization in new territories. The logistical challenges involved in coordinating this migration required sophisticated planning capabilities, with Gothic leaders organising supply systems and establishing temporary camps that could accommodate thousands of refugees during their journey across the Pyrenees. Theodoric the Great's intervention on behalf of his Visigothic cousins provided crucial support that enabled the successful completion of their migration to Spain, while preventing complete destruction of Gothic political organisation. The Ostrogothic king's military forces, dispatched from Italy under the command of experienced generals, established defensive positions that protected Gothic refugees from Frankish pursuit, while simultaneously beginning the reconquest of strategic positions in southern Gaul. This intervention reflected both familial loyalty and strategic calculation, as Theodoric recognised that Frankish expansion threatened broader Germanic interests throughout Western Europe. The establishment of Toledo as the new Visigothic capital represented a deliberate choice that reflected both practical considerations and symbolic significance for a people seeking to rebuild their political identity after catastrophic defeat. The city's central location within the Iberian Peninsula provided strategic advantages for controlling territories that extended from the Pyrenees to the Strait of Gibraltar, while its existing infrastructure and established commercial connections offered foundations for economic recovery. Archaeological excavations within Toledo's medieval quarters have revealed evidence of substantial construction activity during the early 6th century, including new residential districts designed to accommodate Gothic nobles and expansion of existing religious buildings to serve the kingdom's Arian Christian population. The territorial reorganisation that accompanied the establishment of Visigothic rule in Spain required adaptation of administrative systems that had been developed for governing the more compact and ethnically homogeneous territories of the Toulouse kingdom. The Iberian Peninsula's diverse geography, ranging from Mediterranean coastal plains to mountainous interior regions, presented challenges that demanded flexible approaches to local governance while maintaining overall political unity. Gothic administrators implemented provincial systems that balanced central authority with regional autonomy, creating institutional frameworks that could accommodate the varied needs of different territories while ensuring effective military coordination against external threats. The religious landscape of the early Visigothic kingdom in Spain reflected the complex theological divisions that had characterized Christian communities throughout the former Roman Empire since the 4th century. The Arian Christianity that the Visigoths had embraced during their migrations served multiple functions beyond spiritual guidance, operating as a marker of ethnic identity that distinguished Gothic rulers from their predominantly Catholic Roman subjects. This theological framework, which rejected the full divinity of Christ as articulated in the Nicene Creed, had been formally adopted by Gothic leadership during their residence in the Balkans through contact with Arian missionaries who presented a version of Christianity that seemed more compatible with traditional Germanic concepts of hierarchical authority and personal loyalty. Archaeological evidence from Visigothic religious sites dating to the early 6th century reveals the material manifestation of Arian theological principles in church architecture and decorative programs that differed significantly from contemporary Catholic practices. Arian churches typically featured simpler altar arrangements that reflected their rejection of complex liturgical ceremonies, while avoiding the elaborate reliquary displays that characterized Catholic worship spaces. The absence of saint veneration imagery in these early Gothic religious buildings demonstrates the theological distance that separated Arian and Catholic communities, as Arian doctrine emphasized direct relationship with God the Father rather than intercession through saints or elaborate priestly hierarchies. The political implications of religious difference extended far beyond theological debate, creating practical challenges for Visigothic rulers who governed territories where Catholic populations significantly outnumbered their Arian Gothic overlords. The maintenance of separate religious institutions required substantial resources that could have been directed toward military or administrative purposes, while the exclusion of Catholic Romans from high governmental positions limited the pool of educated administrators available for complex bureaucratic tasks. Contemporary correspondence between Visigothic officials and their Roman counterparts reveals ongoing tensions regarding religious policy, with Catholic bishops frequently complaining about restrictions on church construction and limitations on public religious ceremonies. The reign of Liudgild, beginning in 568, marked a crucial turning point in Visigothic religious policy, as the king attempted to address the fundamental contradictions inherent in governing a religiously divided kingdom. Unlike his predecessors, who had generally maintained strict separation between Arian and Catholic communities, Liudgild demonstrated pragmatic flexibility that recognised the potential benefits of religious accommodation while remaining committed to Arian theological principles. His approach involved selective relaxation of restrictions on Catholic religious activities, combined with efforts to promote theological dialogue between Arian and Catholic clergy, creating opportunities for mutual understanding that had been absent during previous decades. The king's personal religious convictions remained firmly grounded in Arian tradition, as evidenced by his continued support for Arian bishops and his patronage of theological scholarship that defended Arian interpretations of scriptural texts. However, Liudgild's political calculations increasingly emphasized the practical advantages that could result from reducing religious tensions within his kingdom, particularly as external threats from Byzantine forces and internal rebellions demanded maximum unity among all elements of Visigothic society. His correspondence with Catholic bishops reveals a ruler who understood the theological differences that separated the communities while seeking common ground that could serve broader political objectives. The theological discussions that occurred during Liudvigild's reign involved sophisticated debates regarding the nature of Christ's relationship to God the Father, with Arian and Catholic scholars presenting detailed scriptural arguments that demonstrated the intellectual sophistication of both traditions. These exchanges, conducted primarily in Latin and occasionally documented in surviving manuscripts, reveal the extent to which religious controversy had become intertwined with broader questions of political authority and cultural identity. Arian theologians argued that their interpretation preserved the proper distinction between divine and human nature, while Catholic representatives insisted that only full recognition of Christ's divinity could provide adequate foundation for Christian salvation. The king's efforts to bridge religious divisions included practical measures designed to reduce the daily friction that resulted from maintaining parallel religious institutions throughout his kingdom. Liudvigild authorised the construction of new churches that could accommodate both Arian and Catholic worship services, though with separate areas and different liturgical practices that respected the theological sensibilities of both communities. Archaeological excavations at several sites have uncovered evidence of these experimental religious buildings, which featured innovative architectural solutions including movable altar furnishings and adjustable seating arrangements that could be reconfigured for different types of religious ceremonies. The rebellion of Hermenegild in 579 transformed what had been gradual religious accommodation into acute political crisis that threatened the stability of the entire Visigothic kingdom. The king's son, who had married a Catholic Frankish princess and subsequently converted to Catholic Christianity, declared his independence from royal authority, while establishing a rival kingdom in southern Spain that explicitly rejected Arian religious policies. This dramatic development forced Liudvigild to choose between religious flexibility and political unity, ultimately leading him to adopt increasingly harsh measures against Catholic populations who were suspected of supporting his rebellious son. The military campaigns that Liudvigild conducted against Hermenegild's forces between 580 and 584 involved not only traditional warfare, but also systematic persecution of Catholic religious institutions that were believed to be providing material support for the rebellion. Royal forces destroyed numerous Catholic churches and monasteries, while confiscating ecclesiastical properties that had been accumulated over centuries of Roman Christian development. Contemporary chronicles describe these actions as representing a fundamental shift in royal policy from accommodation toward active suppression of Catholic religious practice, though modern analysis suggests that Liudvigild's measures were primarily political rather than theological in motivation. The capture and execution of Hermenegild in 584 eliminated the immediate military threat to royal authority, but failed to resolve the underlying religious tensions that had made the rebellion possible. Catholic populations throughout the kingdom viewed the prince's death as martyrdom, creating a powerful symbol of resistance to Arian rule that would influence religious and political developments for decades. The king's victory had been achieved at enormous cost in terms of internal unity, with Catholic-Gothic relations reaching their lowest point since the initial establishment of Visigothic rule in Spain. The final years of Liudvigild's reign saw renewed efforts to address religious divisions through theological compromise rather than political suppression, as the king recognised that military victory alone could not create the stable foundation necessary for long-term governance. His initiatives included attempts to develop modified Arian theological positions that might be acceptable to moderate Catholic clergy, while simultaneously offering political concessions that would encourage Catholic cooperation with royal administration. These efforts achieved limited success, primarily because the fundamental theological differences between Arian and Catholic Christianity could not be resolved through political negotiation or administrative accommodation. The accession of Ricardo in 586 created opportunities for dramatic policy changes that his father's political commitments had made impossible during the final years of his reign. The new king inherited a kingdom where religious division had been exacerbated by recent military conflicts, but he also possessed greater freedom to pursue alternative approaches that could address the fundamental causes of internal instability. Ricard's background included extensive exposure to Catholic theological arguments through his education and diplomatic contacts, providing him with sophisticated understanding of the doctrinal issues that separated Arian and Catholic communities. The king's personal religious journey during the first years of his reign involved intensive study of theological texts and extensive consultations with religious authorities from both traditions, as he sought to understand the implications of potential conversion for both his personal salvation and his kingdom's political stability. Contemporary sources describe private meetings between Ricard and various bishops, including both Arian clergy who had served his father's administration and Catholic representatives who had maintained underground religious activities during periods of persecution. These discussions apparently convinced the king that Catholic theological positions offered more convincing scriptural foundations than traditional Arian interpretations. The political calculations that influenced Ricard's religious decision-making extended far beyond theological considerations to encompass broader strategic relationships with neighbouring kingdoms and the Byzantine Empire. Catholic conversion would align Visigothic Spain with the religious practices of Frankish Gaul and Lombard Italy, potentially creating opportunities for diplomatic alliances that could strengthen the kingdom's position against external threats. The king's correspondence with Pope Gregory VII reveals sophisticated understanding of the international implications of religious policy, with both rulers recognising the potential for Catholic conversion to transform Visigothic Spain's relationships with the broader European Christian community. The Third Council of Toledo, convened in May 589, provided the formal setting for Ricard's public conversion to Catholic Christianity and the official abandonment of Arian theological positions that had characterised Visigothic religious policy since their earliest settlement in Roman territories. The council's proceedings, documented in detailed Latin records that survive in multiple manuscript traditions, reveal the careful orchestration required to manage such a dramatic transformation of royal religious policy. The king's public confession of Catholic faith occurred before an assembly that included bishops from throughout Spain, Gothic nobles and Roman aristocrats whose presence demonstrated the broad support that the conversion had achieved. The theological formula that Ricard pronounced during the conversion ceremony explicitly rejected Arian interpretations of Christ's nature, while embracing the full divinity affirmed in the Nicene Creed, marking a definitive break with the religious traditions that had distinguished Gothic identity for over 2 centuries. The king's statement, preserved in the council's official records, acknowledged the errors of Arian theology while requesting forgiveness for his previous adherence to heretical doctrines. This public admission represented not only personal conversion, but also formal abandonment of the religious policies that had characterised Visigothic rule since the kingdom's establishment. The immediate aftermath of Ricard's conversion involved systematic transformation of religious institutions throughout the Visigothic kingdom, as Arian churches were converted to Catholic use, while Arian clergy either converted to Catholic Christianity or were removed from their positions. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals extensive modification of church buildings, with altar arrangements reconfigured to accommodate Catholic liturgical requirements and new decorative programs installed that reflected Orthodox theological principles. The speed and thoroughness of these changes suggests careful advance planning that had prepared administrative mechanisms for implementing the conversion policy once the king's decision became public. The integration of former Arian and Catholic religious communities required delicate management of competing interests and conflicting loyalties that could easily have destabilized the conversion process. Catholic bishops who had suffered persecution during previous decades demanded punishment for their former oppressors, while Arian clergy who converted to Catholic Christianity sought guarantees that their previous theological positions would not result in permanent exclusion from religious authority. Ricard's solution involved establishing clear procedures for clerical conversion while offering amnesty for past religious conflicts, creating framework for religious unity that balanced justice with practical necessity. The persecution of remaining Arian communities that refused to accept the king's conversion represented the darker aspect of religious transformation, as royal authorities employed increasingly harsh measures to eliminate theological opposition that was viewed as political disloyalty. Contemporary sources describe the confiscation of Arian religious properties, the exile of stubborn Arian bishops, and the forced conversion of Arian lay people who attempted to maintain their traditional religious practices. These policies, while effective in achieving religious uniformity, created resentment among some Gothic communities that viewed the abandonment of Arian Christianity as betrayal of their ancestral traditions. The religious unification achieved under Ricard I created unprecedented opportunities for cultural and intellectual development that would transform Visigothic Spain into one of Europe's most sophisticated civilizations during the 7th century. The elimination of theological divisions that had previously consumed administrative resources and political energy allowed successive kings to focus on projects that enhanced the kingdom's cultural prestige while strengthening its institutional foundations. The reign of Sigebert, beginning in 612, marked the emergence of a distinctly Visigothic approach to governance that combined Germanic political traditions with Roman administrative expertise and Christian theological scholarship, creating a synthesis that would influence European development for centuries. Sigebert's educational background reflected the intellectual transformation that had occurred within Gothic noble families since their settlement in Spain, as aristocratic children now received formal instruction in Latin literature, Christian theology, and Roman legal principles alongside traditional warrior training. The king himself demonstrated remarkable scholarly abilities, composing Latin poetry that displayed sophisticated understanding of classical literary techniques while addressing contemporary religious and political themes. His correspondence with Pope Gregory I reveals a ruler whose intellectual capabilities matched those of the most educated Roman aristocrats, while his administrative reforms demonstrated practical wisdom gained through careful study of imperial governmental models. The cultural flowering that characterized Sigebert's reign extended beyond royal patronage, to encompass broader transformations in Visigothic society, as Gothic and Roman elites increasingly shared educational experiences and cultural values. Archaeological evidence from noble residences dating to this period reveals libraries containing both classical Latin texts and contemporary Christian works, indicating the emergence of a genuinely literate aristocracy that valued intellectual achievement alongside martial prowess. The integration of Roman scholarly traditions with Germanic political structures created unique intellectual environments where theological debate, historical scholarship, and legal analysis flourished under royal protection and encouragement. The establishment of cathedral schools throughout the kingdom provided institutional foundations for the educational revolution that would produce some of medieval Europe's most influential scholars and administrators. These institutions, typically attached to major churches in cities like Toledo, Seville, and Merida, offered comprehensive curricula that included grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, alongside intensive theological training. The schools attracted students from throughout the kingdom and beyond, creating networks of educated clergy and administrators whose shared intellectual formation strengthened the kingdom's institutional coherence while spreading Visigothic cultural influence throughout the western Mediterranean. The intellectual achievements of Isidore of Seville during the early decades of the 7th century represented the culmination of educational developments that had been building since Ricard's conversion. while simultaneously establishing foundations for scholarly work that would influence European intellectual development for centuries. Born around 560 into a family that exemplified the cultural synthesis emerging within Visigothic Spain, Isidore received education that combined classical Roman learning with contemporary Christian scholarship, preparing him for the episcopal responsibilities he would assume upon his brother Leander's death in 600. His appointment as Archbishop of Seville placed him at the centre of ecclesiastical administration, while providing access to one of Spain's most extensive libraries. The Etymologies, Isidore's most ambitious scholarly project, represented an unprecedented attempt to preserve and systematise the entire range of human knowledge as understood in the early 7th century. This massive work, consisting of 20 books that covered topics ranging from grammar and rhetoric to medicine and architecture, reflected the author's conviction that all learning ultimately served divine purposes, while demonstrating his remarkable ability to synthesize information from hundreds of classical and contemporary sources. The encyclopedia's organizational structure, which arranged knowledge according to etymological relationships between words, revealed Isidore's belief that linguistic analysis could uncover the fundamental connections that linked all aspects of human understanding. The scope of classical learning that Isidore preserved through his writings extended far beyond what would have survived without his systematic efforts to collect and organize ancient texts. His work incorporated material from Roman authors whose writings had become increasingly rare as manuscript production declined during the political disruptions of the 5th and 6th centuries. The Etymologies preserved substantial portions of Pliny's natural history, Varro's linguistic studies, and numerous other classical works that would have been completely lost without Isidore's careful compilation and synthesis. His efforts to make this material accessible to contemporary readers involved extensive adaptation and simplification that maintained essential content while presenting it in forms that could be understood by audiences with limited classical education. The theological scholarship that characterized Isidore's extensive religious writings demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of Christian doctrine that had developed within Visigothic ecclesiastical circles following the conversion to Catholic Christianity. His biblical commentaries, doctrinal treatises, and liturgical works revealed mastery of patristic literature that equaled the achievements of scholars in Constantinople or Rome, while addressing specific pastoral concerns that reflected conditions within Visigothic Spain. The integration of classical philosophical concepts with Christian theological principles that characterized these works influenced subsequent medieval scholarship throughout Europe, as manuscripts of Isidore's writings circulated widely among monastic and cathedral libraries. The historical consciousness that emerged within Visigothic intellectual circles during this period found expression in chronicle writing and biographical literature that preserved detailed records of contemporary events while placing them within broader frameworks of Christian historical interpretation. Isidore's chronicle provided comprehensive coverage of world history from creation through his own time, incorporating information from both classical historians and contemporary sources to create a narrative that emphasized divine providence while recording specific details regarding political developments, natural disasters, and cultural changes. This historical perspective influenced subsequent Visigothic chroniclers who continued the tradition of systematic record-keeping that would prove invaluable for modern understanding of early medieval European development. The artistic achievements that accompanied this intellectual flowering reflected the emergence of distinctly Visigothic aesthetic sensibilities that combined Germanic decorative traditions with Roman architectural principles and Christian symbolic programs. The Church of San Juan de Banos, constructed around 661 during the reign of Resuswinth, exemplified the architectural synthesis that characterized Visigothic building projects during the 7th century. The structure's basilican plan followed Roman precedents while incorporating decorative elements that reflected Germanic artistic preferences, creating a visual environment that served both practical liturgical functions and symbolic representation of the cultural unity that had been achieved within the kingdom. The architectural innovations evident at San Juan de Banos included sophisticated solutions to structural challenges that demonstrated advanced understanding of engineering principles, combined with aesthetic sensibilities that created uniquely Visigothic spatial experiences. The church's horseshoe arches, which would later influence Islamic architecture in Spain, represented original developments that enhanced both structural stability and visual impact while creating interior spaces that differed significantly from contemporary Byzantine or Frankish religious buildings. The integration of carved stone capitals featuring intricate geometric and vegetal motifs with overall architectural programs that emphasized harmony and proportion revealed the maturation of indigenous artistic traditions that had absorbed influences from multiple cultural sources. The metalworking traditions that flourished during the Visigothic Golden Age produced objects of exceptional technical and artistic quality that demonstrated the continued vitality of Germanic craftsmanship within the kingdom's increasingly sophisticated cultural environment. Archaeological discoveries from 7th century contexts have revealed jewellery, weapons, and liturgical objects that display mastery of complex techniques, including filigree work, cloisonne enamelling, and repousse decoration. The famous votive crowns from the Guarazar treasure, dating to the reigns of Resuswinth and other 7th century kings, exemplify the extraordinary skill that Visigothic goldsmiths achieved in creating objects that combined practical functions with symbolic significance and artistic beauty. The technical sophistication evident in these metalwork masterpieces reflected not only individual craftsmen's abilities, but also the existence of organised workshop systems that could maintain high standards while training successive generations of artisans. The consistency of style and technique visible across numerous surviving objects indicates the development of recognisable Visigothic artistic traditions that were transmitted through formal apprenticeship systems similar to those that had characterised Roman craft production. The integration of Christian symbolic programs with traditional Germanic decorative motifs in these works revealed the cultural synthesis that had been achieved within the kingdom's artistic communities. The legal developments that occurred during Resuswinth's reign, culminating in the promulgation of the Liber Judiciorum in 654, represented the culmination of efforts to create comprehensive legal systems that could govern the complex relationships existing within Visigothic society. This remarkable legal code, also known as the Lex Visigothorum, represented over a century of legislative development that had gradually replaced the ethnic legal pluralism of earlier periods, with unified juridical principles applicable to all inhabitants of the kingdom, regardless of their ethnic or religious backgrounds. The Code's 12 books contain detailed regulations covering every aspect of civil and criminal law, from property rights and commercial transactions to family relationships and criminal penalties. The sophisticated legal reasoning evident throughout the Liber Judiciorum reflected the influence of Roman jurisprudential traditions, combined with Germanic customary practices and Christian moral principles, creating a synthetic legal system that addressed the practical needs of a diverse society while maintaining theoretical coherence. The Code's provisions regarding property ownership, inheritance rights, and contractual obligations demonstrated detailed understanding of economic relationships that had become increasingly complex as Visigothic society developed more sophisticated commercial and agricultural systems. The integration of Christian ethical principles with practical legal requirements created frameworks for social regulation that balanced individual rights with community responsibilities. The administrative implications of implementing such a comprehensive legal system required substantial expansion of governmental bureaucracy and judicial institutions throughout the kingdom. The code's provisions established hierarchical court systems with clearly defined jurisdictions and appeal procedures, while specifying qualifications for judges and administrative officials who would be responsible for implementing legal decisions. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres dating to this period reveals the construction of substantial governmental buildings that could accommodate the expanded bureaucratic apparatus necessary for effective legal administration, including record-keeping facilities, meeting halls, and residential quarters for official personnel. The economic prosperity that supported these cultural and institutional developments reflected the kingdom's successful adaptation to Mediterranean commercial systems, combined with effective exploitation of Iberian agricultural and mineral resources. The integration of Gothic military capabilities with Roman administrative expertise had created political stability that encouraged commercial development, while the religious unification achieved under Ricard had eliminated sources of internal conflict that had previously disrupted economic activity. Archaeological evidence from urban centres throughout the kingdom reveals substantial commercial growth during the 7th century, with expanded market facilities, increased craft production, and evidence of long-distance trade connections that linked Visigothic Spain with the broader Mediterranean economy. The agricultural foundations of this prosperity rested on systematic exploitation of the Iberian Peninsula's diverse environmental zones, from the fertile river valleys of the Guadalquivir and Ebro to the mountainous regions that provided mineral resources and pastoral opportunities. Visigothic landowners, both Gothic and Roman, developed sophisticated estate management systems that maximised agricultural productivity while maintaining the military obligations that remained central to the kingdom's political organisation. The legal provisions regarding agricultural labour, land tenure, and rural administration contained in the Liber Judiciorum reveal the complexity of relationships that had evolved within Visigothic rural society, where traditional Germanic concepts of personal loyalty coexisted with Roman principles of property ownership and contractual obligation. The urban development that characterised major Visigothic cities during this period reflected both population growth and increasing social complexity, as commercial and administrative activities expanded beyond the capacity of existing infrastructure. Toledo, as the royal capital, experienced particularly dramatic growth, with new residential districts constructed to accommodate the expanding royal court and governmental bureaucracy, while commercial areas were enlarged to handle the increased trade that resulted from political stability and economic prosperity. Archaeological investigations within the city's medieval core have revealed evidence of substantial construction projects, including new churches, administrative buildings, and residential complexes that demonstrate sophisticated urban planning capabilities. The cultural confidence that characterised Visigothic society during its golden age found expression in ambitious architectural projects that rivaled contemporary achievements in Constantinople or Rome, while maintaining distinctive aesthetic characteristics that reflected the kingdom's unique cultural synthesis. The construction of major churches, royal residences, and public buildings during the reigns of Sigebert, Swinthila, and Risaswinth demonstrated both the material resources available for such projects and the artistic vision necessary to create structures that would serve as lasting monuments to Visigothic civilization. The integration of architectural, sculptural, and decorative arts in these projects created comprehensive artistic environments that reinforced the political and religious messages that legitimised royal authority while celebrating the cultural achievements of the kingdom. The intellectual networks that connected Visigothic scholars with their counterparts throughout Europe facilitated the circulation of ideas and texts that enriched the kingdom's cultural development while spreading Visigothic influence beyond the Iberian Peninsula. The correspondence between Isidore of Seville and scholars in Ireland, Italy, and other regions reveals the extent to which Visigothic Spain had become integrated into the broader European intellectual community, with Visigothic libraries serving as important repositories for classical and contemporary texts. while Visigothic scholars contributed original works that influenced development throughout medieval Europe. The magnificent cultural achievements and institutional developments that had characterized the Visigothic Golden Age began to unravel during the final decades of the 7th century as fundamental structural weaknesses within the kingdom's political system created conditions for chronic instability and governmental collapse. The elective nature of Visigothic kingship, which had served the kingdom adequately during periods of strong leadership and external stability, proved increasingly problematic as competing noble factions recognized opportunities to advance their interests through manipulation of succession disputes. Unlike the hereditary monarchies that had developed among the Franks and other Germanic peoples, the Visigothic system required formal election by an assembly of nobles and bishops, creating recurring opportunities for ambitious aristocrats to challenge royal authority while pursuing their own claims to supreme power. The death of Rasiswinth in 672 precipitated the first major succession crisis of the late Visigothic period. As multiple candidates possessed legitimate claims to royal authority, while commanding sufficient military support to make their ambitions credible threats to political stability. The eventual selection of Wamba represented a compromise choice that satisfied neither the most powerful noble families nor the ecclesiastical hierarchy that had gained substantial influence over royal policy during previous decades. Archaeological evidence from royal residences dating to Wamba's reign reveals hasty fortification work and defensive modifications that suggest a ruler who felt constantly threatened by internal enemies, while contemporary chronicles describe an atmosphere of suspicion and intrigue that pervaded the royal court throughout his 8-year reign. Wamba's military capabilities, demonstrated through successful campaigns against Basque raiders in the north and Byzantine forces attempting to establish footholds along the Mediterranean coast, proved insufficient to overcome the political challenges created by his disputed legitimacy and the growing autonomy of provincial governors who increasingly ignored royal commands. The king's efforts to strengthen central authority through administrative reforms and military reorganisation encountered systematic resistance from noble families whose traditional privileges were threatened by these centralising policies. The rebellion of Duke Paul in Septimania during 673 exemplified the type of provincial uprising that would plague successive Visigothic rulers as local strongmen recognised that royal authority had become too weak to enforce obedience effectively. Duke Paul's insurrection began as a localised dispute over taxation and military recruitment policies, but quickly escalated into a comprehensive challenge to royal authority that attracted support from disaffected nobles throughout southern Gaul and northeastern Spain. Paul's background included extensive military experience gained through service in royal campaigns against the Franks, providing him with detailed knowledge of Visigothic military organisation and strategic weaknesses that he exploited effectively during his rebellion. The Duke's forces initially achieved remarkable success, capturing several major cities including Narbonne and establishing control over most of Septimania before royal armies could mount effective counterattacks. Contemporary sources describe Paul's military organisation as incorporating both traditional Gothic warrior bands and professional soldiers recruited from local populations, creating a formidable force that demonstrated the military potential available to ambitious provincial leaders. The strategic implications of Paul's rebellion extended far beyond the immediate territorial losses, as his success encouraged similar uprisings throughout the kingdom, while demonstrating the practical limitations of royal military power when confronted with well-organised opposition. Wamba's response required mobilisation of substantial forces that depleted the royal treasury, while exposing other frontier regions to external attack, creating cascading effects that weakened the kingdom's overall defensive capabilities. The siege of Narbonne during 674 consumed months of campaigning and enormous resources before royal forces finally succeeded in breaching the city's defences. but the victory's costs exceeded its strategic value as other rebellions erupted, while the king's attention remained focused on Septimania. The ecclesiastical dimension of these succession disputes added theological complexity to what might otherwise have remained purely political conflicts, as bishops increasingly asserted their authority to determine the legitimacy of royal candidates based on religious criteria that often reflected factional interests, rather than genuine spiritual concerns. The growing influence of church councils in royal election processes created additional opportunities for manipulation, as ambitious nobles sought to secure episcopal support through promises of territorial grants, tax exemptions, and other concessions that further weakened royal authority. The Fourth Council of Toledo, convened in 633, had established precedents for ecclesiastical involvement in political matters that subsequent church leaders exploited to expand their influence over royal policy while pursuing their own institutional interests. The deposition of Wamba in 680 through a conspiracy that involved both noble and ecclesiastical participants demonstrated the vulnerability of even successful military leaders when confronted with coordinated opposition that exploited the kingdom's institutional weaknesses. The circumstances surrounding Wamba's removal remain disputed among contemporary sources, with some accounts describing a genuine illness that incapacitated the king, while others suggest deliberate poisoning by conspirators who subsequently forced him to take monastic vows that legally disqualified him from continuing royal duties. Archaeological evidence from the monastery where Wamba spent his final years reveals substantial construction projects funded by royal resources, suggesting that his retirement may have been more comfortable than political enemies intended. The elevation of Ervig to replace Wamba marked the beginning of a period characterized by increasingly frequent royal depositions and civil wars that systematically destroyed the institutional foundations that had supported Visigothic governmental effectiveness during previous centuries. Ervig's reign lasted only 7 years, but during this brief period the kingdom experienced multiple rebellions, significant territorial losses to Frankish expansion, and economic disruption that undermined the agricultural and commercial systems supporting royal revenues. The new king's attempts to address these challenges through legal reforms and administrative reorganisation proved inadequate because the fundamental problems resulted from structural weaknesses that could not be resolved through superficial policy changes. The monetary evidence from Ervig's reign reveals the beginning of systematic debasement that would characterise Visigothic coinage during the kingdom's final decades, as royal mints reduced the gold content of treamises while increasing production to meet the growing financial demands created by constant military campaigns and political instability. Numismatic analysis of coins from this period shows declining technical quality alongside reduced precious metal content, indicating the deterioration of the specialised craft knowledge necessary for maintaining monetary standards. The economic implications of this monetary debasement extended throughout the kingdom's commercial systems as merchants and other economic actors lost confidence in royal currency while seeking alternative means of exchange that could maintain stable value relationships. The succession of Egica in 687 brought temporary stability to royal authority, but his reign also witnessed the emergence of new challenges that reflected the kingdom's declining capacity to respond effectively to external threats and internal divisions. The growing autonomy of regional strongmen had created a patchwork of semi-independent territories where local leaders exercised practical sovereignty while maintaining nominal allegiance to royal authority. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites throughout the kingdom reveals extensive defensive construction during this period, with noble residences transformed into military strongholds capable of withstanding extended sieges. These developments indicate the militarization of Visigothic society as political competition increasingly took the form of armed conflict rather than the legal and ceremonial processes that had characterized earlier succession disputes. The Basque uprisings that plagued Egica's reign demonstrated the kingdom's inability to maintain effective control over peripheral territories where non-Gothic populations had never been fully integrated into Visigothic political and cultural systems. The mountainous terrain of the Pyrenean regions provided natural defensive advantages that Basque warriors exploited effectively against royal armies trained for warfare on the open plains of central Spain. Contemporary chronicles describe repeated royal campaigns against Basque strongholds that achieved temporary tactical success, while failing to establish lasting political control, creating a pattern of expensive military operations that drained royal resources without producing strategic benefits. The administrative challenges facing late Visigothic rulers reflected the cumulative effects of political instability on the governmental systems that had been carefully developed during the kingdom's golden age. The legal framework established in the Liber Judiciorum required consistent enforcement through professional judicial personnel, but the constant succession disputes and civil wars had disrupted the training and appointment processes necessary for maintaining administrative competence. Regional governors increasingly ignored royal instructions while pursuing their own interests, creating conditions where royal authority existed primarily in name rather than practical reality throughout much of the kingdom's nominal territory. The urban decline that characterized major Visigothic cities during this period resulted from both political instability and economic disruption, as commercial networks collapsed under the pressure of constant warfare while craft production declined due to the loss of skilled artisans who fled to more stable regions. Archaeological investigations at Toledo, Merida, and other major centres reveal evidence of population decline, abandoned residential districts, and the conversion of former commercial areas into defensive positions. The royal capital itself experienced significant contraction, with substantial portions of the city's residential areas falling into disuse, while the remaining population concentrated around fortified compounds that could provide protection during periods of civil conflict. The military organisation that had once represented the kingdom's greatest strength became increasingly fragmented as noble families developed their own armed forces, while royal armies struggled to maintain discipline and effectiveness. The traditional system of military recruitment through personal obligations to the king had depended on stable relationships between royal authority and noble landowners, but the succession disputes and civil wars had destroyed the trust necessary for effective military cooperation. Regional commanders increasingly viewed their forces as personal assets rather than royal resources, creating conditions where military power served factional interests rather than kingdom-wide strategic objectives. The economic foundation supporting royal authority had been systematically undermined by decades of political instability that disrupted agricultural production, destroyed commercial networks, and consumed accumulated wealth through constant military expenditures. The taxation systems that had provided reliable revenues during periods of stability proved inadequate when applied to regions devastated by civil war, while the costs of maintaining multiple armies and fortified positions exceeded the kingdom's declining fiscal capacity. Contemporary documents reveal royal attempts to address these financial challenges through emergency taxation and confiscation of noble properties, but these measures only intensified political opposition while failing to generate sufficient resources for effective governance. The intellectual and cultural achievements that had distinguished Visigothic civilization during its golden age gradually declined as political chaos disrupted the educational institutions and patronage systems that had supported scholarly activity. The cathedral schools that had produced generations of educated administrators and clergy found their resources diverted to military purposes while their students were recruited for armed service rather than intellectual pursuits. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites shows abandonment of scriptoria and libraries as religious communities fled to more secure locations or were forced to sell their manuscripts to fund defensive preparations. The diplomatic isolation that characterized the kingdom's international position during its final decades reflected both internal weakness and the changing balance of power throughout Western Europe as Frankish expansion eliminated potential allies while creating new security threats. The Visigothic kingdom's traditional role as a major European power had depended on military capabilities and political stability that no longer existed, while neighbouring rulers recognised opportunities to exploit Gothic weakness for their own territorial and political advantage. The correspondence between late Visigothic kings and foreign rulers reveals increasingly desperate attempts to secure external support for internal political struggles, but these efforts proved unsuccessful because potential allies doubted the kingdom's capacity to honour agreements or provide reciprocal assistance. The religious dimensions of the kingdom's decline included growing tensions between secular and ecclesiastical authorities, as bishops sought to preserve their institutional interests, while royal power collapsed around them. The church's substantial landholdings and accumulated wealth made ecclesiastical leaders attractive allies for competing noble factions, but this involvement in political conflicts compromised the church's spiritual authority while contributing to the broader institutional breakdown. Archaeological evidence from religious sites shows defensive modifications similar to those found at secular locations, indicating that even religious institutions recognized the need for military protection during this period of chronic instability. The death of King Witiza in 710 precipitated the final succession crisis that would ultimately destroy the Visigothic kingdom, as competing noble factions pursued their claims to royal authority with unprecedented ruthlessness, while external threats gathered strength along the kingdom's southern and eastern frontiers. The circumstances surrounding Witiza's death remain disputed among contemporary sources, with some accounts suggesting natural causes, while others hint at poisoning by political enemies who sought to prevent the implementation of his planned administrative reforms. Archaeological evidence from the royal palace at Toledo reveals signs of hasty modifications to defensive arrangements during the final months of Witiza's reign, indicating a ruler who recognized the growing threats to his authority but lacked sufficient time or resources to address them effectively. The immediate aftermath of Witiza's death saw the emergence of two primary claimants to royal succession, each commanding substantial military support while representing fundamentally different approaches to addressing the kingdom's mounting crises. Attila, who claimed legitimacy as Witiza's designated heir and controlled territories in northeastern Spain, including the important cities of Zaragoza and Tarragona, advocated for continuation of his predecessor's policies while seeking accommodation with regional strongmen who had achieved practical independence during previous decades. His rival Roderick, whose supporters included powerful noble families from central and southern Spain, promoted more aggressive centralization policies designed to restore effective royal authority throughout the kingdom's nominal territories. Roderick's path to power involved systematic elimination of potential rivals through a combination of military action and political maneuvering that demonstrated both his strategic capabilities and his willingness to employ extreme measures in pursuit of royal authority. Contemporary chronicles describe his forces capturing several major cities through siege operations that revealed sophisticated understanding of military engineering, while his diplomatic initiatives succeeded in securing support from ecclesiastical leaders who viewed his candidacy as offering the best prospects for restoring political stability. The coronation ceremony that formally elevated Roderick to royal status occurred at Toledo during the spring of 710, but the limited attendance and defensive precautions surrounding the event indicated the contested nature of his claim to legitimate authority. The civil war that erupted between Roderick's supporters and the coalition of forces loyal to Attila and other claimants consumed the kingdom's remaining military resources while creating opportunities for external intervention that ambitious foreign rulers were quick to exploit. The conflict's geographic scope encompassed virtually the entire Iberian Peninsula, with major engagements occurring from the Pyrenees to the Strait of Gibraltar as competing armies sought to control strategic positions and economic resources necessary for sustaining extended military operations. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites dating to this period reveals the intensity of combat that characterized these final Visigothic civil wars, with mass burial sites containing hundreds of warriors whose equipment and injuries demonstrate the desperate nature of fighting between forces that recognize the existential stakes involved in determining royal succession. The military capabilities that both sides deployed during this civil conflict represented the culmination of centuries of Visigothic military development, but they also revealed the fundamental weaknesses that had developed within the kingdom's defensive systems as political instability undermined traditional recruitment and training mechanisms. Roderick's forces included substantial numbers of professional warriors whose equipment and tactical organisation reflected Roman military influences, combined with Germanic fighting traditions, while his opponents relied more heavily on regional militias and tribal levies, whose effectiveness varied considerably depending on local leadership and training standards. The fragmentation of military authority that had occurred during previous decades meant that neither side could achieve the decisive concentration of force necessary for rapid victory, prolonging the conflict while exhausting resources that would be desperately needed for defence against external threats. The economic devastation that accompanied this prolonged civil war systematically destroyed the agricultural and commercial foundations that had supported Visigothic civilization during its golden age, creating conditions of widespread hardship that undermined popular support for royal authority, regardless of which claimant ultimately achieved victory. Contemporary documents describe abandoned agricultural estates, disrupted trade networks, and urban populations fleeing to fortified positions as military campaigns devastated the countryside while consuming accumulated wealth through constant warfare. The monetary evidence from this period shows complete collapse of royal coinage systems, with local authorities producing irregular issues that lacked standardized weights or precious metal content, indicating the breakdown of governmental institutions that had maintained economic stability during previous centuries. The international dimensions of the Visigothic succession crisis attracted attention from neighbouring powers who recognised opportunities to advance their own territorial and political interests, while the kingdom remained consumed by internal conflict. Frankish expansion under Charles Martel had already established effective control over territories in southern Gaul that had previously acknowledged Visigothic sovereignty, while Byzantine forces maintained footholds along the Mediterranean coast that could serve as bases for broader intervention if circumstances proved favourable. More ominously, the rapid Islamic expansion that had conquered most of North Africa during the previous decades had brought Muslim armies to the shores of the Strait of Gibraltar, where they observed the Visigothic civil war with growing interest in the possibilities it might create for further territorial acquisition. The Islamic forces that had completed the conquest of North Africa under the leadership of Musa ibn Nusayr represented a military and political system that differed fundamentally from the Germanic kingdoms that had emerged from the collapse of Roman authority in Western Europe. The combination of Arab military leadership with Berber warrior populations had created armies capable of rapid movement across vast distances while maintaining the discipline and coordination necessary for complex siege operations against fortified positions. Their recent victories against Byzantine forces in North Africa had demonstrated their ability to adapt their tactical methods to different types of enemies and terrain, while their administrative systems had proven capable of integrating conquered populations into broader Islamic political structures without requiring complete cultural assimilation. The initial Islamic reconnaissance of Iberian territories began during the final months of 710 as small expeditions crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to gather intelligence regarding Visigothic military capabilities and political conditions. These preliminary operations, conducted under the direction of Tarif ibn Malik and other experienced commanders, established temporary bases on the Iberian coast while conducting systematic surveys of potential landing sites, defensive positions, and local population centres. The information gathered during these reconnaissance missions revealed the extent of Visigothic political fragmentation, while identifying specific opportunities for successful military intervention that could achieve substantial territorial gains with relatively limited initial investment of forces. The decision to launch a full-scale invasion of the Iberian Peninsula reflected careful strategic calculation by Islamic leaders, who recognised that the Visigothic civil war had created unprecedented opportunities for conquest, while the kingdom's defensive capabilities remained focused on internal conflicts rather than external threats. Tariq ibn Ziyad, who received command of the initial invasion force, possessed extensive experience in North African campaigns that had prepared him for the type of rapid conquest operations that would be necessary for success in Spain. His army of approximately 7,000 warriors included both Arab and Berber contingents, whose different fighting styles and tactical specializations could be employed effectively against various types of Visigothic resistance. The Islamic landing at Gibraltar in July 711 proceeded without significant opposition, as Visigothic coastal defences had been weakened by the redeployment of military forces for civil war operations in the interior regions of the kingdom. Tariq's forces established a secure beachhead, while additional troops and supplies arrived from North African bases, creating the logistical foundation necessary for sustained military operations throughout the Iberian Peninsula. Archaeological excavations at the landing site have revealed evidence of temporary fortifications and supply depots that demonstrate the systematic planning that preceded the invasion, with organisational capabilities that enabled rapid expansion of the initial foothold into a comprehensive conquest campaign. The speed of the Islamic advance into Visigothic territory reflected both superior military organisation and the kingdom's inability to coordinate effective resistance, while royal authority remained divided between competing claimants to the throne. Tariq's forces moved rapidly inland from their coastal bases, capturing strategic positions and urban centres through a combination of direct assault and negotiated surrender that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of local political conditions. The Islamic commanders proved particularly adept at exploiting the religious and ethnic divisions that had weakened Visigothic society, offering favourable terms to Jewish communities that had suffered persecution under Christian rule, while encouraging defections among Gothic nobles who recognised the futility of continued resistance. Roderick's response to the Islamic invasion required him to abandon his campaigns against Attila and other domestic rivals while attempting to assemble forces sufficient to confront this unprecedented external threat. The king's strategic situation had become desperate, as he faced the necessity of fighting a two-front war against both internal enemies and foreign invaders, while lacking the resources necessary for either campaign. Contemporary sources describe frantic efforts to negotiate temporary truces with domestic opponents, while mobilising whatever military forces remained available for defence against the Islamic advance. But these initiatives achieved limited success because many regional leaders preferred to preserve their strength for local conflicts rather than risk their forces in royal campaigns. The concentration of forces that Roderick managed to assemble for his confrontation with Tariq's army represented the final mobilisation of Visigothic military power, drawing warriors from throughout the kingdom's remaining territories while stripping defensive positions of the troops necessary for local security. Archaeological evidence from the assembly areas reveals the hasty preparation that characterised this military effort, with improvised supply systems and equipment that reflected the kingdom's declining organisational capabilities. The royal army that eventually took the field included substantial numbers of recently recruited troops whose training and equipment proved inadequate for the type of warfare they would encounter against experienced Islamic forces. The Battle of Guadalete, fought in July 711 near the modern city of Jerez de la Frontera, represented the culmination of the Islamic Conquest campaign and the effective end of organised Visigothic resistance throughout most of the Iberian Peninsula. The engagement occurred on terrain that favoured neither side decisively, with both armies deploying across rolling plains that provided adequate space for the cavalry manoeuvres that would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. Roderick commanded his forces from a position that allowed him to observe the entire battlefield, while maintaining communication with his subordinate commanders, wearing royal regalia that included a golden crown and ceremonial weapons that symbolised the continuity of Visigothic royal authority, dating back to the great migrations of previous centuries. The tactical development of the battle revealed the fundamental differences in military organisation and fighting methods that distinguished Islamic and Visigothic approaches to warfare. Tariq deployed his forces in a formation that maximised the mobility advantages of his cavalry, while utilising archers to disrupt enemy formations before decisive charges could develop. The Visigothic army, arranged according to traditional Germanic battle order, with infantry formations supported by limited cavalry, attempted to exploit their advantages in close combat, while compensating for numerical inferiority through superior individual fighting skills and battlefield experience gained during years of civil warfare. The initial phases of combat involved extensive skirmishing as both sides sought tactical advantages while testing enemy capabilities and resolve. Islamic horse archers proved particularly effective during these preliminary engagements, using their superior mobility and composite bow technology to inflict casualties on Visigothic formations, while avoiding the type of direct confrontation that would favour Gothic warriors trained in traditional close combat techniques. The Visigothic response relied on disciplined infantry advances supported by cavalry charges designed to break through Islamic lines and reach the enemy command positions where individual combat skills could prove decisive. The crisis of the battle developed during the afternoon when coordinated Islamic attacks succeeded in breaking through Visigothic defensive positions while simultaneously threatening the flanks of the royal army. Contemporary accounts describe the confusion that developed within Gothic ranks as communication systems broke down and individual units found themselves isolated from overall command authority. The collapse of organised resistance occurred when rumours spread that King Roderick had been killed or had fled the battlefield, creating panic among troops whose loyalty depended on personal bonds with royal authority rather than abstract concepts of national defence. The death of Roderick during the battle's final stages occurred under circumstances that remain disputed among historical sources, though most accounts agree that the king perished while attempting to rally his retreating forces for a final stand against the advancing Islamic army. Archaeological investigations at the battlefield site have uncovered remains that may include royal equipment, including fragments of decorated weapons and armour that correspond to descriptions of Roderick's regalia in contemporary chronicles. The king's body was never definitively identified, leading to persistent legends that he had survived the battle and escaped to organise continued resistance from mountain strongholds, though no credible evidence supports these romantic narratives. The immediate aftermath of Guadalete saw the complete collapse of organised Visigothic resistance throughout most of the Iberian Peninsula, as news of the royal army's destruction and the king's death eliminated the final symbol of legitimate authority that might have coordinated further defensive efforts. Islamic forces under Tariq's command systematically occupied major cities throughout southern and central Spain, often encountering minimal resistance as local populations recognised the futility of opposing victorious armies while lacking any central authority capable of organising effective defence. The speed of this conquest reflected both Islamic military efficiency and the extent to which Visigothic political fragmentation had undermined the kingdom's capacity for coordinated resistance. The arrival of Musa ibn Nusayr with substantial reinforcements during 712 completed the Islamic conquest of the peninsula while establishing the administrative foundations necessary for long-term occupation and integration of Iberian territories into the broader Islamic world. Musa's forces, numbering approximately 18,000 warriors, included experienced administrators and religious authorities whose responsibilities extended beyond military conquest to encompass the establishment of governmental systems capable of governing diverse populations. The systematic nature of Islamic administrative organization contrasted sharply with the improvised arrangements that had characterized late Visigothic governance, providing stability and efficiency that many inhabitants found preferable to the chaos of the preceding civil wars. The survival of isolated Visigothic resistance in the mountainous regions of northern Spain represented the final remnant of the kingdom that had once dominated the entire peninsula, but these scattered strongholds lacked the resources and coordination necessary for effective opposition to Islamic rule. Archaeological evidence from sites in Asturias and other northern regions reveals defensive preparations that indicate some Gothic nobles had anticipated the kingdom's collapse while establishing fortified positions capable of maintaining local autonomy. These mountain refuges would eventually serve as the nuclei for the Christian reconquest movements that would develop over subsequent centuries, but their immediate impact on the Islamic conquest remained negligible. The cultural and legal legacy of Visigothic civilization proved more enduring than their political institutions, as Islamic administrators recognized the practical value of existing legal codes and administrative practices while adapting them to serve new governmental requirements. The Liber Judiciorum continued to influence legal development throughout medieval Spain, with its principles incorporated into both Islamic legal systems and the Christian kingdoms that emerged during the Reconquest period. The architectural and artistic traditions that had flourished during the Visigothic Golden Age similarly influenced subsequent developments, with Islamic craftsmen adapting Gothic techniques, while Christian communities in the north preserved traditional forms that would eventually spread throughout reconquered territories. The intellectual achievements of Visigothic scholars, particularly the encyclopedic works of Isidore of Seville, continued to circulate throughout medieval Europe regardless of the political changes that had eliminated their original cultural context. Islamic libraries in Spain preserved many classical and Visigothic texts that might otherwise have been lost, while Christian monasteries in the north maintained scriptoria that continued copying important works for transmission to other European centres of learning. This preservation of intellectual heritage ensured that Visigothic contributions to European civilization would survive the destruction of their political institutions. The Islamic conquest of 711 marked the definitive end of Visigothic rule in Spain, concluding nearly 3 centuries of Germanic governance that had transformed the Iberian Peninsula from a Roman province into one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated kingdoms. The speed and completeness of their defeat reflected both the internal weaknesses that had developed during decades of political instability and the superior organization of Islamic forces that represented a new type of political and military system. While isolated Gothic communities would persist in mountain refuges for several generations, the great age of Visigothic civilization had ended, leaving behind architectural monuments, legal codes, and intellectual achievements that would influence Spanish development for centuries to come. The kingdom that had once stretched from the Loire to Gibraltar had been reduced to scattered strongholds, but their cultural legacy would endure long after their political authority had vanished forever.